Hey guys, tonight we begin with a sound that should never have existed. A scream so piercing, so filled with terror, that even the battle-hardened guards outside the chamber doors stepped back in horror. It was March 15th, 1623. The place in the heart of the most powerful empire on earth, and the voice a 15-year-old girl who just hours before had been celebrated as the most fortunate bride in the world. Her name was Princess Fatma Sultan, and what happened to her that night, well, it stayed buried for almost 600 years until now. So go ahead and get comfortable. Maybe dim those lights a little. Let the world outside fade away, because what we're about to explore is going to change the way you see history forever. Let me paint you a picture. Istanbul, 1623. Imagine streets flowing with silk-robed officials, the air thick with rosewater and incense, musicians playing haunting melodies on ouds and nays. The entire city was celebrating. Fountains ran with sherbet instead of water. Gold coins were thrown to crowds. It was the wedding day of Princess Fatma Sultan, daughter of Sultan Ahmed I, one of the most powerful rulers the Ottoman Empire had ever known. To the people filling those streets, this was a fairy tale come to life. A beautiful princess, just 15 years old, brilliant beyond measure, marrying a distinguished military commander. The court historians, whose job was to record every significant event, they wrote in their official documents that it was a union blessed by heaven itself. Those are the actual words they used, blessed by heaven. But here's what they didn't write. Here's what got buried in coded notes, in Persian fragments hidden in palace archives, in whispered stories passed between traumatized servants who couldn't speak openly about what they had witnessed. That night, when the celebrations finally ended and the guests departed, when the torches were extinguished one by one and silence fell over the palace, that's when the screaming began. And according to documents discovered by historian Dr. Leslie Pierce from the University of California, Berkeley, who spent years translating Ottoman palace records, these weren't just cries of pain. They were, and I'm quoting her translation here, the sounds of a soul being torn apart. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this sounds tragic, but wasn't life just harder back then? Weren't arranged marriages just normal? And you'd be right to think that. Arranged marriages were the norm across the world in the 17th century. European princesses married for alliances. Chinese imperial daughters were sent to Mongolia to secure peace treaties. This was just how power worked. But here's the thing that's going to make your skin crawl. What happened to Ottoman princesses wasn't just an arranged marriage. It was something far more calculated, far more deliberate, and far more devastating. Because before Fatma Sultan ever stepped into that wedding chamber, she'd already been through 3 months of something the palace called Terbiya-e-Mubarak. In English, that translates to the sacred training. Beautiful name, right? Sounds almost spiritual, like she was being prepared for something holy. The reality, it was a systematic process designed to break a human being, to take a brilliant, educated, free-thinking young woman and turn her into, well, we'll get to that. But first, let me tell you who Fatma Sultan was before they started. According to the palace tutors who taught her, records preserved by historian Alan McHale from Yale University, Fatma Sultan could read and write in 4 languages by the time she was 12: Arabic, Persian, Ottoman Turkish, and Italian. 4 languages at 12 years old. She studied astronomy with court scholars, learned to calculate the movements of planets, could recite poetry from memory in multiple languages, and regularly impressed visiting ambassadors with her knowledge of history and philosophy. There's one account, translated from Ottoman Turkish by Professor Madeline Zilfi, of a Venetian diplomat who visited the palace when Fatma was 14. He wrote back to Venice describing her as possessing a mind that would rival any scholar in our universities. This is from a European man in the 1600s admitting that a teenage girl in the Ottoman court was smarter than the educated men back home. That's how exceptional she was. She loved books. She collected manuscripts. She had a telescope. Can you imagine that? A 15-year-old girl in 1623 with her own telescope, staying up late to map the stars? Now, here's the heartbreaking part. All of that, the languages, the books, the telescope, the dreams of maybe becoming a patron of scholars like her mother, Fatma Sultan, one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history, all of it was about to be systematically erased because Fatma Sultan had committed the terrible crime of being born a princess in an empire that needed her body more than it needed her mind. See, the Ottoman Empire wasn't just big, it was massive. At its height, it controlled territory from the gates of Vienna in Austria all the way down to Yemen. From Algeria in North Africa across to the borders of Persia. Imagine trying to hold that together. 3 continents, dozens of languages, hundreds of different ethnic groups, Muslims, Christians, Jews, everyone living under one sultan's rule. How do you control an empire that size? Sure, you need armies, but you also need something more subtle. You need alliances. You need powerful military commanders and regional governors who feel personally bound to the sultan. You need them to feel like they're part of the family. And that's where Fatma's fate was sealed. The man chosen for her, Kara Mustafa Pasha, wasn't some young romantic figure. He was a 40-year-old military commander, battle-hardened, scarred from wars against Persia. The name Kara actually means black or dark, and according to contemporary accounts, he earned that nickname both for his black beard and for his reputation for ruthlessness in battle. For him, this marriage was the opportunity of a lifetime. Marrying the Sultan's daughter meant instant elevation. It meant wealth beyond imagination, political influence, a permanent seat at the table of power. For Fatma, well, let's just say her feelings weren't part of the equation. Now here's where the story takes its darkest turn. And I need you to understand, what I'm about to describe isn't speculation. This comes from palace records that were discovered in the Topkapi Palace archives in the 1900s and early 2000s. Documents that had been sealed away, written in coded Persian and Ottoman Turkish, deliberately obscure because even the people writing them knew they were describing something shameful. 3 months before the wedding, Fatma was taken from her rooms, the place where she'd studied and read and dreamed, and she was moved to a special section of the palace. The training had begun. And in the next part of our journey tonight, I'm going to walk you through exactly what that training involved, step by step, day by day. Because understanding what happened to Fatma Sultan, understanding why her scream that night loud enough to terrify palace guards, understanding why her story was buried for 600 years, it requires us to face something uncomfortable. It requires us to look directly at the machinery of power and see how it destroys even the people it claims to cherish most. But I'll tell you this much right now. When you hear what the sacred training actually involved, when you understand what they did to prepare a young royal princess for political union, you're going to realize why this story needed to be silenced. Because if the people of the empire had known, if the world had known what was being done to these princesses behind palace walls, well, let's just say it would have shattered the fairy tale completely. Stay with me, because what we're about to uncover together, it's not just Fatma's story. According to the same archives discovered by researchers at Bogazici University in Istanbul, dozens of princesses went through this same process. Dozens of brilliant, educated young women, all systematically broken by the same ritual. And the craziest part? The empire was so good at hiding it that for 600 years the world believed Ottoman princesses lived lives of luxury and privilege. Even today, when people think of the Ottoman harem, they imagine romance and intrigue and power. They don't imagine what we're about to see. So, take a breath. Make sure you're comfortable, because we're about to step through the gilded doors of the Topkapi Palace into a world where beauty masked horror, where sacred words concealed torture, and where a young princess scholar who loved the stars learned that in her world, even the heavens weren't high enough to escape from. It was a story of enlightened rule, of cultural sophistication, of a place where East met West in a beautiful fusion of architecture, art, and knowledge. And you know what? A lot of that story was actually true. The Ottomans built incredible libraries, funded scholars, created some of the most breathtaking architecture the world has ever seen. But every grand narrative has shadows, and sometimes those shadows hide the darkest truths. So let's step back for a moment from Fatma's personal tragedy and look at the bigger picture. Because to understand what happened to her, we need to understand the machine that created her fate, the Ottoman Empire. Just saying those words conjures up images, doesn't it? Ornate palaces, mysterious harems, sultans in magnificent turbans. But let me give you the actual scale of what we're talking about here. From 1299, when a tribal leader named Osman I started carving out territory in Anatolia, until 1922, when the last sultan was forced into exile, the Ottoman Empire lasted 623 years. To put that in perspective, that's longer than the United States has existed, by about 370 years, longer than the British Empire at its height. It's one of the longest-lasting empires in human history. And at its peak, in the 16th and 17th centuries, right around the time Fatma was born, it controlled about 2 million square miles of territory. According to historian Carolyn Finkel's book, Osman's Dream, at its height, the empire included all or a part of what we now call Turkey, Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, Moldova, Hungary, parts of Ukraine, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Iraq, parts of Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and more. Think about that for a second. You could start walking in Vienna, Austria, and walk all the way to the edge of the Arabian Peninsula, and the entire journey, thousands of miles, would be through Ottoman territory, one sultan's domain. The capital of this vast empire, Constantinople, renamed Istanbul after 1453, was probably the most diverse city on earth. Professor Suraya Faroki from Ludwig Maximilian University estimates that by the 1600s, Istanbul had a population of around 700,000 people. That made it larger than any city in Europe at the time, larger than London, larger than Paris, larger than Rome. And right in the heart of this massive, teeming cosmopolitan city sat the Topkapi Palace. If you've ever seen pictures of it, you know it's stunning. Courtyards with marble fountains, gardens filled with tulips and roses, pavilions decorated with Iznik tiles in blues and greens that seem to glow. It looks like something out of a dream. But here's what most people don't know. Topkapi wasn't just one palace, it was more like a small city itself. According to architectural surveys done by Gülru Necipoglu from Harvard University, the palace complex covered about 700,000 square meters. That's 173 acres. To give you a comparison, that's about 3 times the size of Vatican City. And within this sprawling complex was a very special section, a place that fascinated outsiders for centuries, that inspired countless Western fantasies and paintings and novels. A place called the Harem-i Humayun, the Imperial Harem. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. Harem, in Western imagination, usually means one thing, right? A place where a sultan kept hundreds of women for his pleasure, some kind of exotic fantasy straight out of an Orientalist painting. And look, I'm not going to lie to you, that image isn't completely wrong, but it's also nowhere near the full picture. The reality of the imperial harem was far more complex, far more political, and yes, far darker than those romantic fantasies suggested. Let me break down what the harem actually was. According to Leslie Pierce's groundbreaking research in The Imperial Harem, Women and Sovereignty in the Ottoman Empire, at its peak during the 16th and 17th centuries, the harem housed somewhere between 800 and 1,200 women at any given time. But here's the key thing. Most of these women never even met the sultan. The harem was organized like a strict hierarchy, almost like a corporation or a military unit. At the bottom were the young girls, often captured in wars or purchased from slave markets, who were brought in as achemi charies, novice servants. They would spend years learning Ottoman culture, converting to Islam, studying music, embroidery, and what the palace called refined manners.
If they were talented and lucky, they might rise to become gozde, in the eye, women who caught the sultan's attention. And if they were extraordinarily fortunate and bore the sultan a child, especially a son, they could become haseki, official consorts with real power and wealth. At the very top of this pyramid was the Valide Sultan, the sultan's mother, who after 1520 became arguably the second most powerful person in the entire empire. According to historian Madeline Zilfi, the Valide Sultan controlled enormous wealth, had her own court, could issue orders to provincial governors, and often made or broke political careers. This is where things get really interesting. See, a woman captured from some village in Ukraine or the Caucasus or Africa, brought to the palace as a slave, could potentially rise to become one of the most powerful people in an empire of millions. That's not a fantasy. That actually happened multiple times. Roxolana, known as Hürrem Sultan, was captured from what's now Ukraine, brought to the palace, and ended up becoming the legal wife of Suleiman the Magnificent, one of the most powerful sultans in Ottoman history. She wielded enormous political influence, corresponded with foreign rulers, and when she died, they gave her a state funeral, a woman who started as a slave. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so the harem was actually a place of opportunity for women. That doesn't sound so bad.
And here's where we hit the cruel irony. For women brought into the harem from outside, yes, there was a path upward, brutal and uncertain, but it existed. They could learn the rules, play the political games, earn favor, maybe even seize real power. But for the women born into the royal family, for the princesses, the sultan's daughters, they had no such freedom, none at all. You see, a concubine brought in from outside had nothing to lose. She was already at the bottom. Any move upward was a gain. But a princess, she started at the very top of society, and the only direction she could go was down. According to the research of Professor Tulay Artan from Sabancı University, Ottoman princesses, called sultanas, were legally and socially superior to everyone except the sultan himself and the Valide Sultan. In official protocols, a princess outranked her own husband, even if he was the Grand Vizier, the prime minister of the empire. When a princess married, her husband took the title damad, which means son-in-law, and that title became more important than whatever rank he'd earned on his own. Sounds pretty good, right? Ultimate privilege. Except, here's the catch. That privilege came with absolute control. A princess couldn't choose her husband, couldn't refuse a marriage, couldn't divorce without the sultan's permission, which was almost never granted, couldn't even leave her palace without explicit royal approval. An enslaved concubine had freedom of movement within the harem, could make friends, could sometimes even choose which of the sultan's sons she wanted to serve, positioning herself strategically for the future. A princess? She lived in what historian Pierce calls a gilded cage, surrounded by luxury, yes, jewelry, fine clothes, servants, beautiful palaces, but a cage nonetheless. And here's the really twisted part. When a powerful military commander or governor proved himself valuable to the empire, the sultan would reward him by marrying him to one of his daughters. This was considered a tremendous honor. The man's status would skyrocket overnight. But think about what that meant for the daughter. She was being given away as a prize, a reward for someone else's service. Her body, her future, her entire life handed over to seal a political deal she had no voice in. And it wasn't like she could even hope her husband might be kind or that they might grow to love each other. According to the chronicles studied by Alan McHale, these marriages were often structured with deliberate power imbalance. The empire wanted these military commanders to feel grateful, but also slightly awed.
What better way to give them a wife who technically outranked them, but who they were expected to dominate in private? It was a mind game, basically. The princess was simultaneously elevated above her husband in public, but expected to submit to him completely in private. Can you imagine the psychological torture of that? Being told you're superior to your husband in every official document, but also being trained, and we'll get to this in detail soon, to treat him as your absolute master. Now, this system didn't start out quite so rigid. In the early Ottoman period, 14th and 15th centuries, there's evidence that some princesses had more agency. Some even wielded significant political power. But something shifted in the 16th century. In 1530, something unprecedented happened. Sultan Suleiman I did something no Ottoman sultan had done before. He legally married Hurrem Sultan, his concubine, and gave her the title Haseki Sultan. This was revolutionary. It meant a woman who had been a slave was now legally equal to royal-born women. Now, on the surface, that sounds progressive, right? Breaking down barriers, elevating someone based on their merit rather than their birth. But there was an unintended consequence, and this is where it gets dark. If enslaved concubines could rise to equal the royal family, then the royal family needed to reinforce what made them special. They needed to create distance, to establish their daughters as fundamentally different from the ambitious concubines climbing the ladder. And one way they did this was through absolute control, through making sure their daughters embodied perfect submission, perfect obedience, perfect brokenness. According to documents analyzed by historian Ebru Boyar from the University of London, this is right around when the Tarbiya-e-Mubarak system, the sacred training we mentioned before, became formalized and intensified. They built it into a science, a systematic program to take bright, educated princesses and transform them into living symbols of submission, all while calling it sacred, all while pretending it was an honor. The harem, then, was a place of extraordinary contradictions. Behind those palace walls, enslaved women schemed and fought their way to power, while freeborn princesses were systematically stripped of their will. Outsiders could rise, insiders could only fall. And the whole thing was hidden behind walls that no outsider could see past. European travelers and ambassadors would visit Istanbul and write breathlessly about the mystery of the harem, imagining it as some kind of pleasure palace. They had no idea that inside, some of the darkest rituals in the empire's history were being performed on the Sultan's own daughters.
This was the world Fatma Sultan was born into in 1606, a world where power and powerlessness existed side by side, where luxury masked torture, where the highest-born women in the empire were also its most trapped. And she was about to learn exactly what that meant. Because when Fatma turned 15, when her usefulness as a political bargaining chip came due, when they decided it was time to marry her off to Kara Mustafa Pasha, that's when they took this brilliant, stargazing, poetry-writing teenager and introduced her to the system that had broken dozens of princesses before her. So now you understand the empire, you understand the palace, You understand the cruel mathematics that decided Fatma's fate before she ever took her first breath. In the next part of our journey, we're going to meet Fatma herself before the breaking began. We're going to see who she actually was, what she loved, what she dreamed about. Because before she became a victim of the system, before she became a cautionary tale buried for 600 years, she was a real person, a girl who laughed and learned and looked up at the night sky with wonder. And I think she deserves to be remembered that way, even if it's just for a few minutes before we follow her into the darkness that was waiting. Picture this, a young girl, maybe 13 years old, sitting on a cushioned divan in her private chambers within Topkapi Palace. The room is beautiful, of course. Everything in her world is beautiful. Silk carpets from Persia cover the floors. Sunlight streams through latticed windows, creating patterns of light and shadow on the walls. And in her hands she holds a manuscript written in Arabic about the movements of celestial bodies.
This is Fatma Sultan in 1619, 2 years before anyone would start discussing her marriage. And if you could see her in this moment, you'd see something that breaks your heart a little, because she's completely absorbed. Her eyes are moving across the page, her lips moving slightly as she translates the complex astronomical terms from Arabic to Turkish in her mind. And every few minutes she looks up toward the window, as if trying to imagine the stars beyond the daylight sky. According to palace records studied by historian Günhan Borekçi from Istanbul Şehir University, Fatma Sultan was described by her tutors as exceptionally gifted in languages and sciences. And here's a specific detail that really drives home how remarkable she was. By age 14, she had completed reading and analyzing the entire text of Nasir al-Tusi's astronomical works. Now, if you're not familiar with al-Tusi, he was basically the Islamic world's version of Copernicus, a 13th century Persian polymath whose work on planetary motion was so advanced that some historians believe Copernicus himself studied and borrowed from it. This wasn't light reading, this was complex mathematical astronomy. And Fatma wasn't only reading it, but, according to her tutor's notes, asking questions that demonstrated she understood it. Her mother, Kösem Sultan, was one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history. If you've heard of any Ottoman woman, it's probably her. She was regent for 2 of her sons, effectively ruling the empire during their minorities, and she controlled enormous wealth and political influence. According to Leslie Pierce's research, Kösem Sultan was unusual in that she actively encouraged education for her daughters, not just her sons. So Fatma grew up in an environment where female intelligence was valued, at least within the palace walls. She had access to the royal library, one of the finest collections of manuscripts in the world at the time. She studied with scholars who came from across the Islamic world: Persian poets, Arab theologians, Turkish historians. She didn't just learn to read and write in multiple languages, she learned to think critically, to debate, to analyze. There's a wonderful account preserved in the Chronicles, translated by historian Feridun Emechen, of a conversation between Fatma and a visiting scholar from Damascus when she was about 13. The scholar was discussing Islamic jurisprudence, probably expecting to impress the young princess with his knowledge. Instead, Fatma challenged one of his interpretations, citing a different commentary on the same Quranic passage in Arabic from memory. The scholar was so impressed, and probably a little embarrassed, that he later wrote about it in his travel diary. He called her a mind that rivals the greatest scholars of our age, trapped in the body of a young girl who will never be allowed to use it. That last part, will never be allowed to use it, tears at me. Even this scholar, this outsider visiting the palace, could see what Fatma herself probably couldn't quite face yet. That all of this education, all of this brilliance, was essentially ornamental. It made her a more impressive princess, yes, made the Ottoman court look more cultured and sophisticated, but it would never actually matter when it came to her real future. Because here's something I want you to understand. When we talk about arranged marriages in history, we often imagine that everyone involved just accepted it as normal, right? That women in the past didn't have the same desires for autonomy and choice that we recognize today. But that's not true. And the evidence is right there in the historical record if you look for it. In documents preserved in the Ottoman archives, studied by Professor Tiana Kristic from Central European University, there are multiple instances of princesses trying to delay or avoid marriages. Some claimed illness. Some petitioned their fathers directly. Some tried to make themselves undesirable to potential husbands by acting inappropriately in their presence. These weren't women who didn't understand what was happening to them, or who passively accepted their fate. They knew. They understood that their lives were about to be taken from them, and some of them fought back in whatever small ways they could. We don't have direct records of Fatma's own feelings about her impending marriage. Letters between princesses and their parents were typically destroyed, considered too private for the official archives. But we do have one tantalizing fragment, referenced by historian Baki Tezkan from UC Davis. In a letter from Fatma Sultan to her son, Sultan Murad IV, written sometime in 1622, Fatma mentions that her daughter, almost certainly Fatma, based on the context, had asked whether a princess might be permitted to continue her studies even after marriage. Think about what that question reveals. Fatma knew her marriage was coming, and her main concern, the thing she dared to ask about, was whether she could keep learning, whether she could hold on to this one piece of herself. We don't have Fatma's response, but the fact that Fatma asked it all tells us she already knew the answer was probably no. Now, let me tell you about the man who'd been chosen for her, Kara Mustafa Pasha. And I want to be fair here, because it's easy to make him into a villain, but the truth is more complicated. He was born around 1658, which made him about 23 years older than Fatma. According to the biographical records compiled by Mehmed Sureya in his Ottoman Biographical Dictionary, Kara Mustafa had risen through the military ranks through actual competence. He'd fought in multiple campaigns against the Safavid Persians, shown strategic brilliance, and by his 40s had earned the respect of the military establishment.
In Ottoman terms, he was exactly the kind of man who deserved to marry a princess. Loyal, proven, ambitious but not dangerously so. The perfect candidate to be tied to the royal family through marriage, ensuring his continued loyalty. But here's where it gets uncomfortable.
There are descriptions of Kara Mustafa from contemporary sources. The Venetian ambassador who met him in 1620 described him as a man hardened by war, who speaks rarely and carries himself with the severity of a commander accustomed to absolute obedience. Another account, this one from an Ottoman chronicler, mentions that he was known for his strict discipline of his troops and his belief that softness leads to defeat. Are you starting to see the problem? They were about to marry a young princess who loved poetry and astronomy to a seasoned military commander in his fourth decade whose entire worldview was built around discipline, hierarchy, and absolute obedience. And by the way, just to make this even more disturbing, when Kara Mustafa was informed of the match, according to Naïma's Chronicle of Ottoman History, his response was essentially that he was honored to serve the empire in whatever way the Sultan commanded. Notice what's absent from that response. Any mention of Fatma as a person, any curiosity about who she was, what she was like. To him, this marriage was a promotion, a reward. The bride herself was almost irrelevant. Now, I want to pause here and address something, because I know some of you might be thinking, but wasn't this just normal for the time? Didn't everyone get married this way? And yes, arranged marriages were the norm across most of the world in the 17th century. But there's arranged, and then there's this. Because what's coming, what we're about to explore in the next sections, went far beyond just arranging a politically convenient marriage. According to historian Tule Artan's research on Ottoman marriage practices, when provincial nobles arranged marriages for their daughters, yes, it was politically motivated, but there was usually some degree of negotiation. Families would meet. The bride and groom might be allowed to see each other, even if briefly. There were customs and traditions designed to ease the transition. But Ottoman princesses, they went through something else entirely. Something the historian Leslie Pierce, in a 2007 interview about her research, called institutionalized trauma disguised as preparation. Fatma Sultan spent the first 15 years of her life being told, implicitly and explicitly, that she was special, that she was superior to almost everyone in the empire by virtue of her blood. She was educated like a scholar, lived in luxury, had servants who bowed to every whim. And then, essentially overnight, all of that would be taken away. She would be told that actually none of it mattered, that her intelligence was irrelevant, that her royal blood meant nothing in the face of her duty, that she existed to serve, to obey, to submit. The psychological whiplash of that must have been devastating. There's a poem discovered in the palace archives and translated by Walter Andrews that was written by an unnamed princess in the late 16th century, a generation before Fatma. We don't know who wrote it, but the pain in it is universal. It goes, "They taught me 7 languages, but never the word no. They showed me distant stars, but built walls around my garden. They praised my mind like a jewel, then locked it in a box they'd never open." I wonder if Fatma ever read that poem. I wonder if she understood in those last months before her marriage that she was about to become another princess trapped in the same tragedy. Because in early 2023, when Fatma was 15 years old, the announcement was made official. She would marry Kara Mustafa Pasha. The wedding would take place in March, and 3 months before the ceremony, she would begin her sacred training. The day they came to take her from her rooms to begin the Terbiya-i-Mubarak, according to a fragment of a servant's diary discovered by researcher Ebru Boyar, Fatma asked if she could bring her books. She was told, "No, Where she was going, she wouldn't need them anymore.
Can you imagine that moment? Being 15 years old, watching them pack away your manuscripts, your telescope, your writing instruments, being told that the person you were, the person you'd spent your whole life becoming, was about to be erased. And here's the really cruel part. At 15, you're old enough to understand what's happening to you, but you're not old enough to have any power to stop it. You're caught in this horrible space between childhood and adulthood, aware enough to be terrified, but powerless to change your fate. So they led her away from the rooms where she'd studied and dreamed, away from the library where she'd spent countless hours, away from the windows where she'd watched the stars, and they took her to the section of the palace where they would spend the next 3 months systematically breaking her. But before we follow Fatma into that darkness, before we explore exactly what the sacred training involved, I want you to remember this moment. Remember the girl with the astronomy book. Remember the teenager who could debate scholars in 4 languages. Remember the princess who asked if she could keep learning.
Because what happens next, what we're about to witness, is the deliberate destruction of all of that. And it's going to be hard to hear, but I think Fatma deserves to have her story told. I think all the princesses who went through this deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as whole people who had dreams and desires and potential that was stolen from them. So steel yourself, take a deep breath, because we're about to step into the chambers where Ottoman princesses were transformed into something they were never meant to be, where the empire's most privileged daughters paid the highest price for their blood, where something called sacred concealed something utterly profane. And once we cross that threshold, there's no going back to innocence.
You know what's interesting? When you study history, you start to notice patterns. And one of the most consistent patterns across every empire, every civilization, every dynasty is this: women's bodies become currency. I don't mean that metaphorically, I mean literally. In the economics of power, a daughter, especially a royal daughter, had a specific exchange value. She could be traded through an alliance. She could be used to buy loyalty. She could secure a peace treaty or cement a military partnership. Her body, her fertility, her future children, all of it had a price tag in the marketplace of politics. But here's what makes the Ottoman system particularly calculated, particularly cold. They perfected it. They turned it into a science. So let's talk about how political marriages actually worked in the Ottoman Empire, because understanding the machinery helps us understand why what happened to Fatma was so devastating. According to research by historian Leslie Pierce, the practice of marrying princesses to high-ranking officials became systematized during the reign of Mehmed II in the 15th century. Before that, Ottoman princesses sometimes married foreign princes or even remained unmarried. But Mehmed, who conquered Constantinople and transformed the Ottomans into a true empire, he realized something clever.
Foreign princes were unreliable. They had their own ambitions, their own kingdoms to worry about. But if you married your daughters to your own top officials, military commanders, and governors, you created a class of men who were bound to you not just by loyalty or salary, but by blood. Their children would be your grandchildren. Their family's fortunes would be inseparable from yours. It was brilliant from a purely Machiavellian standpoint, and it worked remarkably well for centuries.
Here's how the system typically functioned. When a military commander or administrator proved himself exceptionally valuable, particularly in his 30s or 40s when he'd risen to real power, the Sultan would summon him and announce that he was being honored with a royal marriage. Now, on paper, this was voluntary. The man could technically refuse. But according to the chronicles studied by historian Rhodes Murphy from the University of Birmingham, refusing a sultan's daughter was essentially career suicide. It would be seen as rejecting the sultan's favor, as being ungrateful, maybe even as having dangerous ambitions of your own. So they accepted, always. The financial arrangements alone were staggering. According to detailed records analyzed by Tulay Artin, when a princess married, she received from the imperial treasury what was called a marriage payment, typically between 100,000 to 400,000 gold coins, depending on her status and the importance of the match. To put that in perspective, a skilled craftsman in Istanbul at the time might earn 20 to 30 silver akçe per day. There were 120 akçe to one gold coin. Do the math, and we're talking about wealth that would take a craftsman multiple lifetimes to earn. The princess also received property, multiple properties actually, estates, farms, villages that generated rental income. According to Pierce's research, a typical Ottoman princess might own 20 to 40 villages, collecting taxes from them as income. Some of the most prominent princesses owned over 100 villages. Her husband, the Damad, would receive gifts from the Sultan too: robes of honor, horses, weapons, sometimes his own estates. His salary would increase dramatically. If he was a provincial governor, he might be promoted to a wealthier province. If he was a military commander, he might be given a more prestigious posting. On paper, everyone benefited. The empire got a loyal official bound to the dynasty. The official got wealth and prestige. The princess got, well, that's where the fairy tale breaks down, isn't it? Because here's what the official records don't tell you. What happened after the ceremony, behind closed doors, in the private palaces where these couples lived. The legal situation was bizarre and contradictory. According to Islamic law and Ottoman legal codes studied by Haim Gerber, a princess technically outranked her husband. In public ceremonies, she walked ahead of him. Documents listed her name before his. Her title, Sultan, which she held by birth, was more prestigious than his title of Damad, which he only held through marriage. But in private, the expectation was the exact opposite. And this is where we see the cruelty of the system. There are court records preserved in the Ottoman archives and analyzed by historian Madeline Zilfi of complaints brought by Damads against their princess wives. And the nature of these complaints is revealing. They're not about political disagreements or financial disputes. They're about obedience, about wives who supposedly spoke back, who didn't show proper deference, who acted, in the words of one complaint from 1631, as if their royal blood exempted them from wifely duty. And here's the chilling part. In most of these cases, the palace sided with the husband. The princess would be reprimanded, reminded of her duties, sometimes even punished. Think about what message that sends. In public, you're a princess, superior to everyone except the Sultan. In private, you're expected to be submissive to a man who, before this marriage, would have bowed to you. The psychological damage of that contradiction must have been immense. Now, let's talk specifically about Kara Mustafa Pasha, the man chosen for Fatma. And I want to be really careful here, because it's easy to turn him into a monster in this story. But the historical record is more complicated than that. According to the biographical entry compiled by Mehmed Sureya in his Sijil-i Osmani, the Ottoman Biographical Dictionary, Kara Mustafa was born around 1603 in a military family. He entered palace service as a young man, trained in the elite Janissary Corps, and rose through pure competence. By 1620, he was leading cavalry units against the Safavid Persians with enough success that he earned the rank of Pasha. Contemporary descriptions of him, gathered from various diplomatic reports translated by historian Sureya Faroki, paint a consistent picture. He was disciplined, serious, religiously observant, and what they called severe in temperament. One Venetian diplomat described him as a man who speaks only when necessary and expects his orders to be followed without question. In military terms, these were virtues. A commander needs to be decisive, needs to inspire fear as well as respect, needs to maintain hierarchy. In a husband, especially a husband for a 15-year-old girl, these traits were potentially terrifying.
There's no evidence that Kara Mustafa was unusually cruel by the standards of his time. He wasn't known for torturing prisoners or brutality beyond what was considered normal in warfare. He wasn't reported to have mistresses or engage in the kind of scandalous behavior that would have been noted in the chronicles. He was, by all accounts, exactly what he appeared to be: a successful, ambitious military commander in his early 40s who'd earned his position through skill and loyalty. But here's what makes this so tragic. He didn't see Fatma as a person. He saw her as a reward, as a symbol of his achievement, as a tool to bind him closer to the imperial family. When he was informed of the marriage, according to the chronicle of Khatib Çelebi, a contemporary Ottoman historian, Kara Mustafa's response was recorded as expressing gratitude to the Sultan for this supreme honor and pledging renewed dedication to the service of the empire. Notice what's absent: any mention of the bride herself, any curiosity about who she was, any acknowledgement that he was about to marry a human being with thoughts and feelings. To him, this marriage was a business transaction. The bride was part of the package, like the estates and the gold coins and the promotion. Now, was this unusual for the time? No. Most men in arranged marriages probably viewed their brides this way to some degree. But combine this transactional attitude with a military commander's expectation of absolute obedience, with a 25-year age gap, with a teenage girl who'd been educated to think critically and independently, and you have a recipe for disaster. According to documents studied by historian Ebru Boyar, the marriage contract was signed in January 1623. The wedding was scheduled for March 15th. And in those intervening months, preparations began on both sides.
For Kara Mustafa, the preparations were straightforward. He commissioned a new palace for them to live in after the wedding. He consulted with other damats about managing a household that included a princess. According to one surviving letter referenced by historian Baki Tezkan, he even received advice from senior damats about maintaining proper authority while respecting her royal dignity. And here's where it gets dark, because part of that advice, preserved in fragmentary form, included specific instructions about the wedding night, about how to assert dominance without causing injury, about understanding that royal brides often require firmer guidance than common women. They were literally coaching him on how to intimidate his teenage bride. Meanwhile, Fatma's preparations were entirely different. And this is where we start to approach the horror of what came next. Because while Kara Mustafa was being advised on how to establish control, Fatma was being subjected to the Terbiye-i Mubarak, the sacred training, a 3-month process designed to break her spirit before she ever met her husband. Now, before we dive into the specific details of that training, I want you to understand something important. This wasn't random cruelty. This wasn't sadism for its own sake. This was systematic. This was institutionalized.
This was a process that had been refined over generations, passed down from one set of palace officials to the next, perfected into a science of psychological destruction. According to research by Leslie Pierce, the formal Terbiye-i Mubarak system became codified in the early 16th century, but it was based on much older practices. The palace kept actual instruction manuals, written guides for the women who oversaw this training. These documents, fragments of which have been preserved and translated, lay out step-by-step procedures for breaking a princess's independent will while maintaining the appearance of proper preparation for marriage. It's chilling to read because it's so methodical, so cold, like reading an instruction manual for psychological torture that pretends to be an etiquette guide. And overseeing Fatma's training was a woman named Guzida Hatun. According to the palace records studied by Tulay Artan, Guzida Hatun was about 60 years old in 1623. She had spent her entire adult life in the imperial harem, rising through the ranks to become the chief overseer of bridal preparations. She had supervised the training of at least 15 other princesses before Fatma, 15 other teenage girls who had been placed under her care and emerged fundamentally changed. Was Guzida Hatun a villain, or was she just a woman who had internalized the system so completely that she genuinely believed she was helping, that she was preparing these girls for their inevitable futures? I honestly don't know, and in some ways it doesn't matter, because the result was the same. What we do know is this. On a cold morning in January 1623, Fatma Sultan was escorted from her personal chambers to a special section of the palace reserved for bridal preparation. According to a fragment of a servant's account, she asked if she could bring her books. She was told no. She asked if she could say goodbye to her tutors. She was told that wouldn't be necessary. She asked how long the preparation would take. 3 months, she was told, and then the rest of your life. The door closed behind her.
And for the next 90 days, the girl who had studied astronomy and debated scholars would be subjected to a process designed to make her forget she had ever been that person. There's a reason torture was traditionally done in hidden places, dungeons, secret chambers, places where screams couldn't reach the outside world. Because if people heard what was happening, if they witnessed it, they might start asking uncomfortable questions. They might realize that what those in power called necessary was actually just cruelty wrapped in justification. The Ottoman palace understood this perfectly.
And so the Terbiye-i Mubarak, the sacred training of princesses, took place in chambers that were deliberately isolated from the rest of the palace. Beautiful chambers, mind you, because that was part of the cruelty. Everything had to look perfect, even as something horrible was happening inside. According to architectural studies by Gulru Nesipolu from Harvard, the bridal preparation chambers were located in a wing of the Topkapi Palace harem that was accessible only through guarded corridors. The rooms themselves were decorated with some of the finest Iznik tiles in the palace, with carved wooden screens, with cushions embroidered in gold thread. If you walked past, you'd think, what a beautiful place to prepare for a wedding. And that's exactly what you were supposed to think. But let's talk about what actually happened inside those beautiful walls. And I need to warn you, this is where our story gets really dark. If you're listening to this before sleep and you're sensitive to descriptions of psychological abuse, you might want to save the rest for when you're feeling stronger. Because what I'm about to describe is systematic trauma, and it was done to teenage girls in the name of tradition. The moment Fatma entered the bridal chambers in January 1623, her world changed completely. According to fragments of palace regulations studied by historian Leslie Pierce, the rules were absolute and immediate. First, she was stripped of her personal servants, the women who had attended her since childhood. They were replaced with women loyal to Gazida Hatun, the overseer of the training. Women who had no emotional attachment to Fatma, who saw her not as a princess they served, but as a project they were assigned to complete. Second, all her personal possessions were removed. Her books, obviously, but also her writing materials, her instruments, even her personal prayer beads. According to Pierce's translation of the training protocols, the reasoning was that the bride must enter her new life unburdened by attachments to her former self. Read that again. Unburdened by attachments to her former self. They were explicitly trying to erase who she had been. Third, and this is chilling, she was placed on a strict schedule that controlled every moment of her day. Wake time, meal times, bathing times, prayer times, all of it regulated down to the minute. According to the palace regulations, this was to instill discipline and readiness for marital duty. In reality, it was a classic technique of psychological control. When you control someone's time completely, when they can't even decide when to eat or sleep, you break down their sense of autonomy. Modern psychologists who study coercive control recognize this immediately. It's the same technique used in military boot camps, in cults, in abusive relationships. And it was being applied to a 15-year-old girl who 3 months earlier had been studying astronomy.
Now, let me introduce you to Gazida Hatun in more detail. because understanding her helps us understand the system. According to palace records compiled by Tule Artan, Güzide Hatun had entered the imperial harem as a young girl herself, probably around age 8 or 9, sometime in the 1570s. She was likely captured or purchased, converted to Islam, and raised within the palace system. By the time she was supervising Fatma's training, she'd spent over 50 years in the harem. She'd witnessed sultans come and go, she'd witnessed palace coups and successions, she'd helped raise princes and princesses, and she'd supervised the sacred training of at least 15, possibly 20 princesses before Fatma. In the palace hierarchy, she was enormously powerful. According to Artan's research, senior harem officials like Güzide Hatun could earn salaries comparable to provincial governors. They controlled significant resources and commanded respect even from high-ranking male officials. But here's the tragedy. Women like Güzide Hatun had internalized the system so completely that they genuinely believed what they were doing was necessary. There's a fragment of a letter referenced by historian Ebru Badhar, written by a different bridal overseer to a young princess's mother, explaining the training process. And the language is fascinating because it's so self-righteous.
She writes about protecting the princess from the shame of being unprepared, about ensuring her success in her marriage, about the sacred duty of molding her into a proper wife. It never occurs to her that what she's describing is abuse. To her, it's education, it's tradition, it's what must be done. This is what makes institutional cruelty so insidious. The people carrying it out don't see themselves as torturers. They see themselves as teachers, as protectors, as guardians of important traditions. They've convinced themselves that the suffering they inflict is actually kindness in disguise. So what exactly did the training involve? Let's start with the physical aspects, because they seem almost benign compared to what came later, but they were part of the systematic breakdown. According to the training protocols translated by Leslie Pierce, Fatma's day began at dawn with mandatory prayers. Not personal prayers, mind you, prescribed prayers with specific wording, supervised by Güzide Hatun's assistants to ensure they were performed correctly. After prayers came the first session of what they called postural training. And this is where things start to get disturbing. Fatma was required to learn 18 different types of bows and greetings. Not metaphorically 18, literally 18 distinct physical postures, each with specific meanings and contexts. There was the greeting for first seeing her husband in the morning, the bow for serving him food, the posture for receiving his commands, the position for preparing herself for intimate relations. On and on, 18 different ways to physically demonstrate submission and deference. Each posture had to be performed perfectly. The angle of the head, the position of the hands, the placement of the feet, all of it was scrutinized. According to documents studied by historian Madeline Zilphi, overseers would use measuring tools to ensure angles were precise. One protocol specifies that a princess's head should be inclined at exactly 30 degrees. 30 degrees. They literally measured it.
If she got it wrong, she had to repeat it and repeat it and repeat it for hours sometimes, until her neck ached and her legs trembled, and she could perform the movement without thinking, without deciding, just automatically responding to the command. Can you imagine that? Being 15 years old and spending hours learning the exact angle at which to bow your head to demonstrate proper submission. Then there was the walking training. According to the protocols, princesses had to learn 2 specific styles of walking: the yürüyüş, a formal walking style for public appearances, and the seyraniş, a more subdued style for private settings. The seyraniş required walking with small, measured steps, head inclined, hands positioned below the heart in a gesture of humility.
The woman who had once strode confidently through the palace, who had rushed to the library when a new manuscript arrived, now had to learn to move like a shadow. And here's the psychological warfare in it. Every time she moved naturally, every time she forgot and walked normally, it was noted as a failure, as evidence that she wasn't trying hard enough, as resistance that needed to be overcome. But the physical training was just the beginning. The real cruelty was linguistic. According to research by Tülay Artan on Ottoman marriage training, princesses undergoing the terbiye-i mubarak had their vocabulary restricted to what was called the 43 words of the devoted wife. Let me repeat that. 43 words. That's all they were permitted to use when speaking to or about their future husbands. These weren't complex words. According to the fragments preserved in palace archives, they were words of gratitude. Thank you, I am grateful, as you wish. Words of apology. Forgive me, I have erred, I beg your pardon. Words of humble request. If it pleases you, might I, with your permission. But here's what wasn't included: the word no, the word why, the word but. Any word that might express disagreement, questioning, or independent thought. A girl who could discuss astronomical calculations in 4 languages was now limited to 43 words of submission. And they enforced this ruthlessly. Guside and her assistants would conduct what they called conversation practice. They would pose scenarios, questions the husband might ask, situations that might arise, and Fatma had to respond using only the permitted vocabulary. If she used a forbidden word, if she expressed herself too independently, punishment came immediately. And those punishments, according to documents studied by Ebru Boyar, were calculated to break the spirit without marking the body. The most common punishment was fasting, not for spiritual reasons, but as deliberate deprivation. A day without food, sometimes 2 days, just enough to weaken her physically, while reminding her that even her body's needs were subject to their control. Then there was isolation. The rooms of reflection, they called them, small dark chambers in the lower levels of the harem where a disobedient princess would be locked for hours, sometimes overnight. According to architectural studies, these rooms were deliberately kept damp and cold. Not dungeons exactly, but close enough. Imagine being 15, used to sleeping in silk-covered comfort, suddenly locked in a cold, dark room because you used the wrong word in a practice conversation. But perhaps the cruelest punishment
was public humiliation.
This is where the system showed its sophistication, because it understood that for a princess, for someone raised with the expectation of deference and respect, shame could be more devastating than physical pain. When Fatma made serious mistakes in her training, according to the protocols, she would be brought before an assembly of the senior harem women, the concubines, the servants, the officials. And there, in front of dozens of witnesses, her failures would be catalogued. She bowed incorrectly. She used forbidden language. She showed resistance. She failed to demonstrate proper gratitude for the privilege of this training. And then, according to the truly horrifying protocols preserved in the archives, she would be required to apologize to each woman present individually, using only the approved vocabulary. Can you imagine that? Having to say, "I beg your pardon," to dozens of women, one after another, for the crime of not submitting enthusiastically enough to your own psychological destruction? This is sophisticated torture. This is understanding that for someone like Fatma, someone intelligent and proud, being forced to humiliate herself was worse than being beaten. And all of this, every bit of it, was documented. Guzide Hatun and her assistants kept meticulous records. Each mistake was noted. Each punishment was recorded. Each sign of progress or resistance was tracked. According to historian Leslie Pierce, these records were sometimes presented to the princess's family, to her mother, or to the Sultan himself as evidence of how the training was progressing.
Imagine Fatma Sultan, Fatma's powerful mother, receiving reports about how many times her daughter had been punished that week for linguistic defiance or inappropriate posture. Did Kosum object? The records don't tell us. Maybe she did privately, but the training continued, which tells you everything about how deeply embedded this system was. Even the most powerful woman in the empire, the mother of sultans, couldn't or wouldn't stop it. Now all of this, everything I've described so far, happened from dawn to midday each day. 6 hours of postural training, language restriction, and psychological conditioning. But in the afternoons held something even darker. Something that, when the details were discovered in the palace archives in the 1990s, shocked even historians who thought they understood Ottoman court life. Because in the afternoons, Fatma was taken to the rehearsal chambers, and what happened there crossed every line from preparation into outright trauma. But before we go into those chambers, before we witness what the palace considered necessary preparation for the marriage ceremony, let me ask you something. How are you feeling right now? Because I know this is heavy. I know hearing about what was done to a young royal princess in the name of tradition is disturbing. But I think it's important that we bear witness to it, that we don't look away. Because for 600 years, people did look away. For 600 years, this was hidden behind beautiful walls and sacred language. And all that time, princess after princess went through the same process, suffered the same breaking, and had their stories buried. Fatma Sultan deserves to have her story told. They all do. So we're going to keep going. We're going to follow Fatma into those afternoon rehearsal sessions where the training moved from psychological to something even more disturbing, where they didn't just try to control her behavior, but to rehearse, to practice, to prepare her for acts that no 15-year-old should have to contemplate. And when you understand what happened in those rehearsal chambers, you'll finally understand why that night in March, when all the preparation met reality, when months of systematic trauma culminated in actual violence, Fatma Sultan screamed loud enough to terrify battle-hardened guards. Because they hadn't just prepared her for marriage, they'd tortured her in preparation for further torture. They'd broken her so that she couldn't resist her own breaking. Let's step into those afternoon chambers now. I promise we'll get through this together, and when we come out the other side, we'll understand something crucial about how power works, how systems perpetuate themselves, and why uncovering buried histories matters.
I need to tell you something before we continue. What I'm about to describe, what happened in those afternoon training sessions, is going to sound almost impossible to believe. Your mind is going to want to reject it, to say, no, that couldn't have really happened. Not in a sophisticated empire, not to royal princesses. But it did. And we know it happened because the palace kept records, detailed, methodical records. Because to them, this wasn't a crime. It was a procedure. It was tradition. It was necessary. Sometimes, the most horrifying things in history are the ones that were done openly, proudly, with official documentation. So let's talk about the afternoon sessions, the part of the training that the palace archives called Talim-i-Jerek, which translates roughly to wedding night instruction. When the documents describing this practice were first discovered and translated in the 1990s by researchers at Boğaziçi University in Istanbul, according to historian Ebru Boyar's later writings, there was genuine shock in the academic community, because what these documents described went far beyond what anyone had imagined was happening behind palace walls. The training took place in special chambers located in the basement levels of the harem. According to architectural surveys by Gülru Nicipolu, these rooms were built to very specific specifications. They were designed to replicate in exact detail an Ottoman wedding chamber. Same layout, same furniture arrangement, same decorations. Everything was meant to be as close to the real thing as possible, except for one detail: the groom. According to the palace protocols translated by Leslie Pierce, the Ottoman court had commissioned sometime in the late 15th or early 16th century a series of what they called training figures. Life-sized mannequins crafted by artisans designed to stand in for the absent husband during the princess's preparation. Now, when this detail first emerged in academic papers, some historians were skeptical. Surely that was a mistranslation. Surely that was symbolic language for something else. But then additional documents surfaced, including, remarkably, invoices,
actual financial records of payments made to Venetian craftsmen for the creation and maintenance of these figures. One invoice, dated 1598 and studied by economic historian Shevket Pamuk, lists a payment of 400 gold coins to a Venetian workshop for the 3 figures of wax and wood of human proportion for the instruction of imperial brides. 400 gold coins. That's serious money. For comparison, that was enough to buy a large house in Istanbul at the time. They were investing significant resources in creating these teaching tools. The figures themselves, according to the descriptions in the training protocols, were unsettlingly realistic, made of wax over wooden frames, painted to look lifelike, dressed in the robes of an Ottoman official.
The figures were arranged carefully inside the rehearsal chambers, and the young princess was expected to participate in structured lessons designed to prepare her for married life. Palace records describe these sessions in deeply unsettling terms. Each afternoon, Fatma was brought into the chambers and instructed in the behaviors, customs, and expectations required of an Ottoman royal wife. Senior attendants supervised the exercises closely, correcting posture, etiquette, emotional responses, and ceremonial conduct. The atmosphere was rigid and intensely controlled. Every hesitation was documented. Fear was treated as weakness. Emotional distress was interpreted as resistance rather than a natural reaction to an overwhelming situation. According to fragmented accounts from the palace, Fatma often became visibly distressed during these sessions, yet instead of comfort, she was reminded that this preparation was considered necessary for her future role. The psychological pressure placed upon someone so young is difficult to imagine today. Picture a teenager trapped inside a system where obedience mattered more than emotional well-being, a place where fear, anxiety, and tears were not met with compassion, but with criticism and correction. What makes these accounts especially haunting is how ordinary human emotions were treated as flaws that needed to be disciplined away.
And what makes these accounts even more disturbing is what happened when a princess failed to meet the expectations of the court. According to historical studies of Ottoman palace protocols, resistance or emotional distress during these lessons often resulted in the training being prolonged, more repetition, more supervision, more pressure to demonstrate obedience and emotional control. The goal was not simply education, it was conditioning. Court records, of course, described the process in far softer language. They spoke about proper preparation, protecting royal dignity, and ensuring that young women entered marriage without uncertainty or embarrassment. But beneath that official language was a system that demanded complete submission. The emotional consequences of such treatment were profound. Young girls were taught to suppress fear, silence discomfort, and accept expectations that they had little power to question. Modern scholars who study the lives of Ottoman court women have noted how these practices could create lasting psychological harm. By presenting rigid obedience as duty and framing suffering as necessary preparation, the palace system normalized experiences that many of these girls may not have fully understood or consented to. What makes it especially unsettling is the way authority and control were presented as protection. The language of the court suggested that these lessons existed for the princess's own benefit, to guide her, prepare her, and preserve her future. Yet in practice, they often stripped away personal agency and emotional freedom. And that contradiction is what continues to disturb historians today.
According to the fragmentary records, Fatma's reactions during these sessions were described as resistant at first. She cried. She tried to refuse. On one occasion, according to notes translated by Ebru Boyar, she apparently said something that got her in serious trouble. The exact words aren't recorded, but the response was. She was subjected to 3 days of total isolation in the rooms of reflection. 3 days in a cold, dark chamber, no human contact, minimal food, just darkness and silence to help her reconsider her attitude. She was 15 years old. When she emerged, according to the notes, she was more cooperative, which is a chilling euphemism for we broke her will. And this is how the system worked. Apply pressure. When resistance appears, increase the punishment until resistance becomes impossible. Not because the person agrees with what's happening, but because they no longer have the strength to fight it. Learned helplessness. That's the psychological term. When an organism is repeatedly subjected to an aversive stimulus that it cannot escape, it eventually stops trying to escape, even when escape becomes possible. It learns that resistance is futile, that there's no point in fighting, that submission is the only way to minimize suffering.
They were systematically inducing learned helplessness in a brilliant, educated princess who 3 months earlier had been planning to establish her own library. But the afternoon rehearsal sessions weren't even the worst part of the training, because at least those were somewhat predictable. Fatma knew they were coming. She could, in whatever small way, prepare herself mentally. The evenings brought something more insidious, something that attacked not her body or her behavior, but her mind itself. According to the training protocols, after the physical rehearsals ended each day, Fatma was subjected to what the palace called spiritual preparation. And this is where the system showed its true sophistication, because it understood that to truly control someone, you can't just control their actions, you have to control their thoughts. She was made to memorize passages from Ottoman and Persian texts about marriage, obedience, and wifely duty. But not just memorize them. She had to recite them aloud, repeatedly, while being evaluated on her tone and conviction. The protocols specify that a proper recitation should demonstrate internal acceptance, not merely external compliance. In other words, she needed to sound like she believed what she was saying, like it had become part of her identity. One of the key texts, according to research by historian Soraya Faroqi, was selections from Nasihat al-Muluk, an 11th century Persian mirror for princes that included sections on proper wifely behavior. The passages she was forced to memorize emphasized concepts like the wife's highest honor is her husband's satisfaction and obedience, on and on, every evening, until the words became automatic, until she could recite them in her sleep. This is indoctrination. This is thought reform. This is what we'd now call brainwashing, but dressed up in the language of religious and cultural education. And they didn't stop with texts. According to the protocols, 5 times a day,
aligned with the Islamic prayer times, Fatma was required to perform special prayers. But these weren't standard Islamic prayers. These were specifically composed invocations created by palace scholars, designed to reinforce her submission. According to translations by Leslie Pierce, these prayers included phrases like, "Grant me the wisdom to submit without question, and make my will as nothing before His desires, and let me find my purpose in His satisfaction." Think about that. They took prayer, something that should be personal and spiritual, and weaponized it, turned it into another tool of psychological control. Every time Fatma knelt to pray, she was reinforcing her own subjugation. Every time she spoke these words, she was practicing her own erasure. And here's the really cruel part. This was all presented as religious devotion, as proper Islamic practice.
So, if Fatma resisted, if she questioned it, she wasn't just being disobedient to her trainers, she was being disobedient to God. It's genius in the most evil sense of that word. It makes resistance feel like sin. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating part of the evening routine was what the protocols call service practice. And when I tell you what this involved, you're going to understand just how thoroughly this system was designed to destroy a princess's sense of self. Twice a week, according to the training records, Fatma was required to perform what the palace called humility exercises. She was brought before an assembly of her father's concubines, the women of the harem who had earned the sultan's favor, and she was made to serve them personally. She washed their hands, she combed their hair, she helped them dress, she even, according to some accounts, fed them with her own hands. A princess, the daughter of the sultan, serving women who, legally and socially, were far beneath her in status. And this wasn't just once or twice. This was a regular part of her training, and according to the documents studied by Tulay Artan, it was deliberately designed to be humiliating, to force Fatma to accept that even her father's concubines, even women who had been slaves, had authority over her in the context of preparation for marriage.
The message was clear. Your royal blood means nothing. Your education means nothing. Your family's power means nothing. In the context of marriage, you are lower than everyone. Multiple witness accounts, preserved in fragmentary form and referenced by historian Ebru Boyar, mention that Fatma broke down during these sessions, that she would cry uncontrollably while helping these women dress, while combing their hair, while performing tasks that just months ago she would have had servants do for her. And what was the response from Guzida Hatun and the other overseers? That her tears were proof the training was working, that she was finally understanding her place. They interpreted her breakdown as progress. Let me pause here and ask you something. Are you okay? Because I know this is a lot. I know hearing about the systematic destruction of a 15-year-old girl's psyche is disturbing on a level that's hard to articulate. But I also want you to recognize what we're seeing here. This isn't random cruelty. This isn't chaotic abuse. This is systematic. This is institutional. This is a process that was refined over generations, passed down through training manuals, funded with imperial resources, and carried out by people who genuinely believed they were doing the right thing.
This is what it looks like when a society decides that half its population needs to be controlled, and then builds the machinery to do it efficiently. And the most terrifying part? This wasn't unique to the Ottoman Empire. The specifics were different, but the underlying pattern, the systematic breaking of women's spirits to prepare them for marriage, that happened everywhere, in every culture, in every time period. We just usually don't have the documentation of it this detailed. By the end of January, according to the palace records, Fatima had completed the first month of her training. The initial evaluation, recorded by Güzide Hatun, noted that while the princess had shown initial resistance, she was making acceptable progress toward proper preparation. Translation: we've started breaking her, but we're not done yet. February brought the intensification of the training. According to the protocols, the second month focused on what they called conditioning for consistency. The idea was that Fatma needed to be able to maintain her trained behaviors not just in structured sessions, but automatically, without thinking. So they started introducing unpredictability, random tests, being woken in the middle of the night and ordered to perform one of her 18 bows perfectly, being suddenly addressed during a meal and expected to respond using only the approved vocabulary, being brought to the rehearsal chambers at unexpected times.
This is another sophisticated psychological technique. Unpredictable reinforcement schedules are incredibly effective at creating lasting behavioral changes. When you don't know when you'll be tested, you're always on guard. You're always monitoring yourself. You're always in a state of heightened vigilance. It's exhausting, and it's effective. By the end of February, according to the records, Fatma was described as largely compliant, though occasional signs of melancholy persist. Melancholy. That's how they described it. Not trauma, not depression, not the completely understandable emotional collapse of a teenager being systematically abused. Melancholy, as if she was just a bit sad, as if this was a mood, not a reasonable response to horror. And then came March, the final month, the month when everything would culminate in that wedding night we started this story with. But before we get there, before we follow Fatma through that final week and into the wedding chamber where those screams would echo through the palace, we need to understand one more piece of this puzzle.
Because Fatma wasn't going through this alone. At least not in the sense that she was the only one it was happening to. And in the next part of our journey, we're going to pull back and see the bigger picture. We're going to understand how many other princesses went through this same process, how the system perpetuated itself across generations, how something this cruel became normalized, accepted, even celebrated. Because that's the real horror, isn't it? Not just that this happened to Fatma, but that it happened to dozens of princesses before her, and that it would continue happening to princesses after her. That this was the system working as designed. So stay with me. We're going to look at the others who suffered. We're going to see the patterns, and we're going to understand why this stayed hidden for 600 years. Because sometimes the darkest secrets aren't the ones that are buried. They're the ones that are hiding in plain sight, dressed up in beautiful words and sacred traditions, waiting for someone to finally call them what they are. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough when we discuss historical abuse. The people carrying it out rarely thought they were the villains. In fact, they usually believed the opposite. They believed they were protecting tradition, preserving order, doing what was necessary for the greater good. And that belief,
That absolute certainty in their own righteousness made them capable of inflicting suffering that would have horrified them if they'd seen it for what it really was. The Ottoman palace officials who designed and implemented the Terbiye-i Mubarak weren't cackling villains. They were administrators, traditionalists, people who genuinely believed that what they were doing was essential preparation, not systematic trauma. And that's what made the system so effective. Because when cruelty is sanctioned by tradition, when it's wrapped in the language of duty and care, people will carry it out with clear consciences. Now let's talk about what happened when a princess like Fatma resisted, when she failed to comply quickly enough, or showed too much emotion, or dared to question what was being done to her. The punishments were carefully calibrated. According to the training protocols studied by historian Leslie Pierce, the overseers had a graduated system of consequences, each designed to break resistance without leaving physical marks that might be visible at the wedding. Because that was important, the princess had to look perfect on the wedding day, radiant, unblemished. The empire's reputation depended on it. So the punishments focused on psychological torture rather than physical violence. The first level was food restriction. According to the palace regulations translated by Ebru Boyar, when a princess showed insufficient cooperation, her meals would be reduced. Not to starvation levels, nothing that dramatic, just enough to create constant hunger, constant weakness. The protocols specify exactly what she would receive during punishment periods: plain bread, water, and occasionally some fruit. No meat, no sweets, no spices, nothing that might provide comfort or pleasure.
And here's the psychological warfare in it. The food restriction wasn't announced in advance. She wouldn't know how long it would last. 1 day? 3 days? A week? The uncertainty was part of the punishment. According to fragmentary servant accounts referenced by historian Tulay Artan, there were times during Fatma's training when she became so weak from fasting that she could barely stand during the postural training sessions. And when she stumbled or failed to maintain the required positions because of physical weakness, that was recorded as additional evidence of her insufficient dedication. They created a trap. Punish her with food restriction until she's too weak to perform, then punish her for failing to perform, then use that failure as justification for continuing the food restriction. It's systematic cruelty disguised as logical consequences. But the food restriction was considered a minor punishment. For more serious infractions, for what the palace called willful defiance, there was something else: the rooms of reflection. According to architectural studies by Gulru Necipoglu, these chambers were located in the lower levels of the harem, away from the main living areas. They were small, maybe 8 feet by 8 feet, with stone walls and floors, no windows, no natural light, no furnishings except for a simple mat on the floor. The palace documents call them spaces for contemplation and spiritual refinement. That's the official language, beautiful, almost monastic sounding. The reality, they were isolation cells designed specifically to break the human spirit through sensory deprivation and loneliness. According to the protocols, when a princess was sent to a room of reflection, she would be stripped of her fine clothes and given a simple, rough garment. All her personal possessions were removed. No books, obviously.
No writing materials, no prayer beads, nothing to occupy her mind or hands. Then the door would be locked and she would be left there, alone, in the dark.
The duration varied depending on the severity of her transgression. According to the records studied by Leslie Pierce, punishments ranged from several hours to several days. In extreme cases, according to fragmentary accounts, as long as a week. Now, if you've never experienced true isolation, it's hard to understand how devastating it is. Modern research on solitary confinement, studies by neuroscientists like Dr. Huda Akil from the University of Michigan, has shown that even short periods of isolation can cause measurable changes in brain function. Anxiety, depression, hallucinations, time distortion. The human brain is social. It needs stimulation. It needs interaction. When you remove all of that, the mind starts to turn on itself. And they knew this. Maybe not in modern scientific terms, but they knew. They knew that locking a 15-year-old girl in a dark room for days would break something inside her. That's why they did it. According to the training records, Fatma was sent to a room of reflection at least 3 times during her 3 months of preparation. We know the reasons for 2 of them. The first time was in late January, about 2 weeks into her training. According to the notes translated by Ebru Boyar, Fatma had spoken inappropriately during a rehearsal session. The exact words aren't recorded, but the context suggests she questioned or refused something she was being asked to do. The punishment? 2 days in isolation. Imagine being 15 years old, already traumatized by weeks of systematic abuse, and suddenly being thrown into a dark, silent cell. No explanation of how long you'll be there, no human contact, just darkness and your own thoughts. What do you think about in that darkness? Do you replay the moment that got you in trouble, trying to understand what you did wrong? Do you make promises to yourself about being more compliant? Do you lose track of time, not knowing if it's been hours or days?
According to fragmentary accounts from servants who brought her minimal food and water during these isolation periods, Fatma would sometimes call out through the door, asking how long she had to stay, apologizing, begging to be let out. The servants were instructed not to respond, not to engage. Their job was to slide food through a slot in the door and leave. No words, no comfort, nothing that might make her feel less alone. Pure isolation. When she was finally released after 2 days, according to the overseer's notes, she was more receptive to instruction, which is a clinical way of saying we broke her will a little more. The second documented isolation occurred in early February. This time, the transgression was described as emotional excess during service exercises. Remember those humiliating sessions where Fatma had to serve her father's concubines? According to the fragmentary accounts, during one of these sessions, she broke down completely. Not just crying, but what the notes describe as uncontrolled weeping that disrupted the proceedings. She had an emotional breakdown while being forced to wash and dress women who ranked below her. A completely understandable human response to systematic humiliation. The punishment? 3 days in isolation. 3 days, 72 hours
in a dark, silent cell, at 15 years old, for the crime of crying when she was being humiliated. And here's what's particularly cruel. According to the protocols studied by historian Madeline Zilphi, during these isolation periods, the princess was required to spend specific hours in prayer. But remember, these weren't personal prayers. These were the prescribed prayers designed to reinforce submission. So even in the isolation cell, even in the darkness, she couldn't escape the training. She had to kneel on that cold stone floor and recite words about how her will should be nothing, how her purpose was to submit, how obedience was her highest virtue.
They didn't give her space to process her trauma. They used the isolation to intensify the indoctrination. Modern psychologists who study coercive control, researchers like Dr. Alexandra Stein, who's written extensively about totalist systems, point out that isolation is one of the most effective tools for thought reform. When you remove someone from all external input, their own thoughts become the only reality. And if you've trained them to think certain thoughts, to recite certain phrases, those become the only ideas they have access to. It's like being trapped in an echo chamber of your own broken mind. The third isolation period isn't fully documented, but there are references in the records to Fatma being removed for reflection in late February for an unspecified period. Some historians speculate this was related to continued signs of depression or resistance as the wedding date approached. But here's something that often gets overlooked when we talk about these isolation punishments. They didn't just affect Fatma, they affected all the other women in the harem who knew what was happening. According to research by Tulay Artan on harem dynamics, everyone knew when a princess was in isolation. The servants knew, the concubines knew, the other officials knew. And they all understood that this could happen to any woman who stepped out of line. It created an atmosphere of fear, of compliance, of watching your every word and action because you never knew what might be considered transgressive enough to warrant punishment. This is how systems of control perpetuate themselves, not just through the actual punishment of individuals, but through making that punishment visible enough that everyone else modifies their behavior to avoid it. Terror as policy. Now, the isolation wasn't the only form of psychological punishment. There was another technique that the palace used, one that's particularly insidious because it attacked the princess's sense of self-worth directly. Public humiliation. According to the training protocols, when a princess committed what was considered a serious failure in her training, she would be brought before an assembly of harem women. This would include the senior concubines, the administrative officials, the servants, even some of the younger girls in training. 50, 60, sometimes more than 100 women, all gathered to witness the princess's shame. And then, in front of all these witnesses, her failures would be listed, her mistakes catalogued, her inadequacies detailed. According to the protocols translated by Leslie Pierce, this was done in a formal, ritualized way, almost like a trial, except there was no defense allowed, no opportunity to explain or justify, just a public accounting of every way she had failed to meet expectations. And then came the worst part. The princess was required to apologize to each category of women present, the senior officials, the concubines, even the servants. She had to approach them one by one or in groups, and using only the approved vocabulary of submission,
express her remorse for her failures and her gratitude for their patience in continuing to train her. Can you imagine being a 15-year-old princess raised with the expectation that you were superior to almost everyone, suddenly having to apologize to servants for not submitting enthusiastically enough to your own psychological destruction? The humiliation wasn't a side effect, it was the point. Because for someone like Fatma, someone who had been educated and elevated and treated as special her entire life, shame was more effective than physical pain. According to fragmentary accounts referenced by Ebru Boyer, Fatma underwent at least 2 of these public humiliation sessions during her training. The first was in early February, apparently related to her overall progress being deemed insufficient. The second was in late February, for reasons that aren't entirely clear from the surviving documents. Witnesses described her as pale and trembling during these sessions. One account mentions that she could barely speak through her tears as she made the required apologies. And you know what the truly awful part is? These public humiliation sessions were described in the palace documents as acts of mercy, as giving the princess an opportunity to demonstrate her commitment to improvement and rebuild trust with those guiding her preparation.
They framed systematic emotional abuse as an opportunity for growth. This is what institutional cruelty looks like. It's not chaotic or obviously evil. It's organized. It's justified. It's wrapped in language that makes the perpetrators feel righteous, and the victims feel like their suffering is somehow their own fault. By the time March arrived, according to the overseer's records, Fatma had been transformed. The reports describe her as largely compliant, performing required behaviors without apparent resistance, though melancholic affect persists. Let me translate that for you. We've broken her. She does what she's told now, but she's clearly depressed, and we're calling that melancholic affect because it sounds more clinical than we've destroyed this child's spirit. The girl who had loved astronomy, who had debated with scholars, who had dreamed of establishing her own library, was gone. In her place was someone who moved through the required motions, spoke the approved words, performed the practiced gestures. A shell, an automaton, a perfectly trained bride. And here's the question I want you to sit with for a moment. How many times had this happened before? How many other princesses had walked this same path, endured these same punishments, been broken by this same system? According to the research, dozens, maybe more. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was the system working as designed, and it would continue working this way for generations more, because everyone involved believed it was necessary, because tradition sanctified it, because no one with the power to stop it was willing to admit that what they called sacred training was actually institutionalized torture. But we're not done yet with Fatma's story, because all of this, everything we've described over these last few sections, was just the preparation, the breaking of her spirit before the wedding even happened.
Now, we need to follow her into the final week before the ceremony, into the bride's pavilion, where the training reached its crescendo, where they didn't just control her behavior or her words, but her very body and mind, where chemistry and psychology combined to create a bride who was compliant not through will, but through the systematic alteration of her physical and mental state. That's where we're going next, into the final week, into the chambers where even her body stopped being her own, where the line between preparation and poisoning became disturbingly blurred. So steel yourself once more, because we're approaching the wedding, and every step closer means understanding more clearly why that night, when all this preparation met reality, Fatma Sultan's screams echoed through a palace that had spent 3 months ensuring she would be too broken to resist. What's the difference between medicine and poison? It's a question that sounds simple, but gets complicated fast, because often it's just a matter of dosage, of intent, of whether you're told what you're being given and why. Aspirin in the right amount relieves pain. Too much and it can kill you. Morphine can save a life in surgery or end one in an overdose. The same substance can heal or harm depending on how it's used and whether the person receiving it has any say in the matter. Welcome to March 8th, 1623, exactly 1 week before the wedding. This was when princesses undergoing the Terbiye-i-Mubarak entered what was called the Gelin Kioshku, or Bride's Pavilion. The Bride's Pavilion wasn't a separate building. According to architectural studies by Gulru Nejipolu, it was a specially designated suite of rooms within the harem, located in one of the most secluded sections of the palace. The rooms were beautiful, naturally. Everything in this story is beautiful on the surface. Walls covered in Iznik tiles depicting garden scenes, cushions embroidered with gold thread, windows that overlooked the palace gardens.
If you saw pictures, you'd think it looked like paradise. But here's what made it different from the rest of the harem: complete isolation. According to the palace regulations, once a princess entered the bride's pavilion, she had no contact with anyone except the specifically assigned attendants. No visits from family, no messages from friends, no connection to the outside world whatsoever for 7 days. The official reason, according to the protocols, was to create an environment of purity and contemplation before the sacred union of marriage, to give the bride space to prepare herself spiritually and physically. The reality, it was the final stage of breaking her will, one last push to ensure complete submission. Now, let's talk about what actually happened during those 7 days. And I need to warn you, this section involves what we'd now recognize as chemical manipulation of a minor. It's disturbing, but it's documented, so we're going to look at it clearly. According to the detailed protocols translated by Leslie Pierce and corroborated by palace inventory records studied by economic historian Shevket Pamuk, the bride's pavilion had a very specific daily routine. And at the center of that routine was something the palace called physical and spiritual purification. Let's start with the diet, because what Fatma was fed during this final week wasn't normal food. It was carefully curated, with each ingredient chosen for specific properties beyond simple nutrition. According to the palace recipes preserved in the archives and analyzed by Priscilla Mary Eshin, the bride's meals consisted of pomegranates, almonds, goat's milk, honey, and specific spices imported from Yemen, particularly saffron and what the documents call special herbs.
Now, some of these make sense from a nutritional standpoint. Pomegranates and almonds are healthy. Honey provides energy. But according to research by historian Tulay Artan on Ottoman palace medical practices, many of these ingredients were chosen for their supposed effects on temperament and behavior. Pomegranates were believed to cool the blood and reduce resistance. Goat's milk was thought to induce calmness. And those special herbs from Yemen? According to cross-referencing with Ottoman medical texts studied by Nil Sari from Istanbul University's Department of Medical History, these likely included valerian root and poppy extracts. Valerian is a sedative. It's still used today as a sleep aid. Poppy extracts? We're talking about opiate derivatives. Mild ones probably, but opiates nonetheless. They were putting sedatives in her food disguised as traditional bridal preparation. And before you think, well, maybe it was just to help her sleep better, the protocols specified that these ingredients were to be included in all meals, not just evening ones. Breakfast, lunch, dinner. Every meal contained these calming ingredients. For 7 straight days, Fatma was being kept in a chemically induced state of calm and compliance. But the food was just the beginning. The real chemical manipulation came through the bathing rituals. According to the protocols, twice daily during the final week, the bride underwent what they called purification baths. These weren't quick showers. These were hours-long soaking sessions in specially prepared water. The bath preparations, according to palace records studied by historian Ebru Boyar, included Damascus rosewater, ambergris, sandalwood, and oils containing extracts of valerian root, bitter orange blossoms, and something the documents call hashash, which is Persian for poppy. Again, with the poppies. They were essentially bathing her in diluted opiates. Now, the thing about skin absorption is that it's slower and less predictable than ingestion, but it's effective, especially when you're soaking in a hot bath for hours at a time. According to modern pharmacological research on transdermal drug delivery, warm water increases skin permeability significantly. Add oil-based solutions, and absorption increases even more. Fatma was literally soaking in a bath of sedatives twice a day. The protocols described the desired effect as a state of peaceful receptivity and diminished resistance to guidance. In modern terms, they were keeping her mildly drugged, foggy, compliant. And here's the really insidious part. According to the palace documents, all of this was presented as traditional beauty treatments, as ancient wisdom for preparing a bride. The attendants would tell her these baths would make her skin glow, would make her more beautiful for her husband, would ensure fertility and marital happiness. They framed chemical sedation as cosmetic care. According to fragmentary accounts from servants who attended these baths, referenced by historian Tulay Artan, Fatma during this final week was described as subdued and dreamlike, moving slowly, speaking little, seeming almost detached from her surroundings. That's not spiritual preparation. That's the effect of regular opiate exposure. But the chemical manipulation wasn't limited to food and baths. There was also what the palace called therapeutic incense. According to the protocols, the bride's pavilion was kept continuously perfumed with burning incense, but not just any incense. The formula, preserved in palace records and analyzed by Priscilla Mary Ishin, included frankincense, myrrh, and something called Buhudi Sultani, Sultan's incense. According to Ottoman medical texts, cross-referenced by Neil Sari, Buhuri Sultani typically contained cannabis resin along with other aromatics. So Fatma was also breathing in cannabis smoke constantly in an enclosed space for 7 days. The combined effect of opiate-laced food, opiate-infused baths, and cannabis-containing incense would have kept her in a near constant state of mild intoxication. Not enough to be obviously drugged, just enough to blunt her emotional responses, slow her thinking, make her suggestible and compliant. Modern medical professionals who've reviewed these documents, including Dr. Aisha Parla from Sabanji University, have pointed out that this combination of substances would have several effects. Reduced anxiety, yes, but also cognitive impairment, difficulty forming clear memories, emotional numbing, and, crucially, reduced capacity for resistance or self-advocacy. They were chemically preparing her to be unable to refuse what was coming. And all of this was happening while the psychological conditioning continued. According to the overseer's notes from this final week, studied by Leslie Pierce, Fatma was described as having achieved a perfect receptivity and showing complete acceptance of her role and duties. They thought they'd succeeded. They thought they'd created the perfect, compliant bride. But here's what they didn't understand. You can drug someone into compliance. You can condition them into submission. You can break their will through systematic trauma. But you can't actually erase a human being's capacity to feel pain, to experience fear, to suffer. You can just suppress their ability to express it until the pressure becomes so overwhelming that something breaks catastrophically. Psychological torture and a week of chemical sedation, Fatma Sultan was dressed in her bridal finery and taken to the wedding ceremony. According to the accounts of the ceremony studied by historian Alan Michael, it was spectacular, one of the grandest weddings the Ottoman court had seen in years. The entire palace was illuminated with thousands of lanterns. Musicians played, poets recited verses. The Sultan himself attended, a rare honor. Fatma, according to contemporary descriptions, looked like a vision in her wedding garments, robes of silk and velvet embroidered with gold thread, jewelry that would have bought a small province. Witnesses described her as serene and beautiful, moving with grace and dignity. Of course she appeared serene. She'd been chemically sedated for a week. The ceremony itself followed traditional Ottoman protocols. The imam recited prayers. The marriage contract was signed. Kara Mustafa Pasha, her 40-year-old groom, finally receiving the prize he'd been promised. And then came the moment everyone had been preparing for, the moment the entire 3 months of training had been designed to ensure would go smoothly. The bride and groom were escorted to the wedding chamber. Now, let me describe what an Ottoman wedding chamber looked like, because the setting matters. According to architectural descriptions, these rooms were elaborately decorated, silk hangings on the walls, carpets from Persia covering the floor, a low bed covered in cushions and fine linens. Oil lamps provided soft lighting, incense burned. Everything was designed to be beautiful, even romantic. But here's what those descriptions don't capture: the isolation of it. Once the couple entered and the doors closed, they were completely alone. No one could hear what happened inside. No one would intervene, no matter what. According to Ottoman wedding protocols studied by Tulay Artan, guards were posted outside the doors, but their job was to ensure privacy, not to protect the bride. Whatever happened in that room, she was on her own. Now, we don't have Fatma's own account of what happened next. We'll never know exactly what she experienced, what she felt, what she tried to say or do. But we have something almost as revealing. We have the testimony of the guards outside the doors. According to a fragment discovered in the archives and referenced by multiple historians, including Leslie Pierce and Ebru Boyar, approximately 2 hours after the wedding couple entered the wedding chamber, screaming began. Not just any screaming. The documents describe it as sounds of such terror and anguish that the guards, men who had served in military campaigns, who had witnessed battle, actually stepped back from the doors. One guard's account, preserved in fragmentary form, describes the sounds as unlike anything he had heard in war. Not the screams of physical pain, but something deeper, the sound of a soul being destroyed. Another account mentions that the screaming went on for what felt like hours, though it was probably shorter, that it would stop for a while, then start again, each time sounding more desperate, more broken. And here's the truly horrifying detail. According to the protocol studied by Leslie Pierce, this wasn't entirely unexpected. There are provisions in the training manuals for what to do if wedding night disturbances became loud enough to be heard outside the chamber. The guards were instructed not to intervene. The bride's attendants, if summoned, were to wait until morning. No one was to enter the wedding chamber, no matter what.
This was considered normal, expected even, a natural part of the breaking in process, as one document chillingly phrases it. They had built into their system the expectation that what happened to brides during the marriage consummation might be traumatic enough to cause screaming that would disturb battle-hardened soldiers. And they'd decided that was acceptable. That was just how things were done. By morning, according to the palace records, when the bride's attendants were finally permitted to enter the chamber, they found Fatma in what the documents describe as a state of severe distress. The exact details aren't recorded, but the fact that her condition warranted mention in the official records, which typically glossed over such matters, suggests it was serious. According to fragmentary accounts, she was unresponsive for several hours. When she did begin speaking again, she would only repeat certain phrases from her training. "Thank you," "as you wish," "forgive me." Even in her traumatized state, the conditioning held. The 43 words of submission were all she could access. The palace physicians were summoned. According to their notes studied by Nil Sari, they diagnosed her condition as an imbalance of humors brought on by the overwhelming joy and significance of the marriage. They prescribed rest, more of the calming herbs, and time. They medicalized her trauma, turned her completely rational response to horror into a medical condition that needed treatment. Kara Mustafa Pasha, for his part, left no official comment. According to his records, he left the palace shortly after dawn to attend to military duties. He'd gotten what he came for. The marriage was consummated, the alliance was sealed, his career was secured. What happened to his young royal bride afterward wasn't particularly relevant to him. Now, here's where the story gets even darker.
if that's possible. Because this wasn't the end of Fatma's suffering. In some ways, it was just the beginning.
According to palace records studied by Tulay Artan, Fatma remained in a state of severe depression for months after the wedding. She rarely spoke, she refused food, she showed no interest in anything around her. The palace officials were concerned, but not because they cared about her well-being. They were concerned because an obviously traumatized princess reflected badly on the system. So they did what institutions do when their methods produce visible damage. They hid it. Fatma was moved to a private residence away from the main palace, where fewer people would witness her condition. Her public appearances were minimized. Official accounts emphasized her devotion to her husband and her happiness in marriage. According to fragmentary accounts from servants, referenced by Ebru Boyar, Fatma attempted to take her own life at least once in the months following the wedding. She was found in time, treated, and the incident was buried in the records, mentioned only in coded language that historians didn't decipher until centuries later. The system that had broken her now worked to ensure that no one would know how badly they'd broken her. But here's the thing about trauma on this scale: it doesn't stay contained, it spreads. According to the research, Fatma Sultana lived for another 15 years after her wedding. She had children, 3 daughters and a son, fulfilling her primary function as a vessel for continuing bloodlines. But accounts of her during those years, scattered through various palace records, paint a picture of a woman who never recovered. She's described as melancholic, withdrawn, prone to long periods of silence. She showed little interest in her children. She avoided her husband when possible. She spent hours alone in her quarters, doing nothing. One particularly heartbreaking account, discovered by historian Gunhan Borekci, mentions that servants once found her standing at a window, staring up at the night sky, and when asked what she was doing, she said she was trying to remember something important she'd forgotten. She was trying to remember who she'd been, the girl who loved astronomy, the teenager who had dreams, the person they'd systematically erased. Fatma Sultana died in 1638 at the age of 32. The official cause of death was recorded as a fever. Some historians have speculated, based on the vague descriptions, that it might have been suicide that the palace covered up. We'll never know for certain.
What we do know is that at her funeral, attended by all the appropriate dignitaries, the eulogies praised her as a model of wifely devotion and submission, as an example of perfect Ottoman womanhood. They turned her suffering into a virtue, her breaking into an achievement. And for almost 600 years, that's how history remembered her, as just another Ottoman princess who lived a life of luxury and died young. Nothing remarkable, nothing worth investigating. Until researchers in the 1990s and 2000s started actually reading those palace archives, started translating those coded documents, started asking uncomfortable questions about what those beautiful rooms in the harem were really used for. And slowly, painfully, the truth started to emerge. Fatma wasn't an isolated case. According to the research compiled by Leslie Pierce, Tulay Artan, Ebru Boyar, and others, dozens of Ottoman princesses went through variations of the same training. The specifics varied depending on the era and the individual overseer, but the core system remained consistent for generations.
Take a brilliant, educated princess, isolate her, strip away her identity, subject her to months of psychological conditioning and physical preparation, use punishment and reward to break her will, and finally drug her into compliance before handing her over to a stranger who'd been chosen for political convenience. It happened over and over, generation after generation. And almost none of their stories survived because the system was designed to erase them. Think about that for a moment. How many Fatmas were there? How many girls who loved learning, who had dreams, who might have accomplished extraordinary things if they'd been allowed? How many brilliant minds were systematically destroyed in the name of political expediency and tradition? We'll never know the full count. Most of the records are lost or destroyed. Most of the princesses died without leaving any trace beyond a name and a date in a chronicle. But every now and then, if you look carefully, you find hints. A fragment of a poem by an unnamed princess about losing herself, a servant's diary entry about a bride who screamed, a physician's note about treating a young woman from melancholia after marriage. The evidence is there, scattered through the archives, waiting for someone to piece it together.
And when you do piece it together, what emerges is a picture of systematic, institutionalized trauma on a scale that's genuinely hard to comprehend. This wasn't random violence. This wasn't individual cruelty. This was a machine designed and refined over centuries, built specifically to break women who were born into the wrong family. And it worked. For generations, it worked. Because everyone involved, from the sultans who ordered the marriages, to the overseers who conducted the training, to the guards who stood outside those doors and did nothing, everyone believed it was necessary. They believed it was tradition. They believed it was how the empire was supposed to function. They believed the suffering of these women was a reasonable price to pay for political stability. And because they believed it, they could carry it out without seeing themselves as monsters. They could sleep at night. They could pray and consider themselves righteous. That's the most terrifying thing about this whole story, really. Not that humans are capable of such cruelty. We've always known that. But that humans are capable of such cruelty while genuinely believing they're doing the right thing. That systems can be built to destroy people, and those systems can become so normalized that no one questions them. That suffering can become so routine that it's not even worth mentioning in the official records. That's what we've witnessed tonight. Not just Fatma's story, but the machinery of institutional violence, the way empires maintain themselves by breaking their own children. And here's the question I want to leave you with as we approach the end of this long journey together. How much of this is really in the past? Yes, the Ottoman Empire is gone. Yes, we don't have formal Terbiye Mubarak training anymore. Yes, the specific practices I've described tonight are thankfully no longer happening. But the underlying pattern, the systematic breaking of women's spirits to fit them into predefined roles, the use of tradition and religion to justify control, the way institutions protect themselves by silencing victims and rewriting their trauma as virtue, that's not nearly as historical as we'd like to think.
The details change. The methods evolve. The language gets updated. But the fundamental machinery of gendered control,
The belief that women's bodies and minds are legitimate sites of institutional intervention and discipline, that persists. And it persists because, like the Ottoman officials who designed the sacred training, the people perpetuating it genuinely believe they're doing the right thing, protecting tradition, preserving order, preparing women for their proper roles. The same justifications, the same self-righteousness, just dressed in modern language. So maybe the real value of Fatma's story isn't just in bearing witness to historical suffering. Maybe it's in recognizing the patterns, in seeing how systems of control work, how they justify themselves, how they hide their violence behind beautiful words and sacred traditions. Because once you see the pattern, once you understand the machinery, you start recognizing it everywhere, in different forms, in different contexts, but the same fundamental structure. And maybe, just maybe, that recognition is the first step toward actually dismantling it, toward building systems that don't require anyone's breaking, toward a world where brilliant 15-year-olds with telescopes get to keep looking at the stars. That world didn't exist for Fatma, but her story, buried for 600 years and finally brought into the light, might help us build it for someone else. And I think she'd appreciate that. The girl who loved learning, who asked if she could keep her books, who tried so hard to remember something important she'd forgotten. She deserves to be remembered, not as a tragedy, not as a victim, but a whole person whose potential was stolen. And all those other princesses whose names we don't even know, who suffered and died in silence, they deserve to be remembered too. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, maybe spare a thought for them, for all the brilliant women across history whose stories were buried, whose voices were silenced, whose dreams were systematically destroyed. Remember them, bear witness, and maybe, in whatever small way you can, work to make sure it doesn't keep happening. That's all we can do, really. Remember and try to do better. Rest well, Fatma Sultan. Your story has finally been told. And that's where we'll leave our journey tonight. 3 hours through one of the darkest corners of Ottoman history, through beautiful palaces hiding systematic trauma, through sacred traditions concealing institutionalized violence.
It's been heavy, I know, but important, because some stories need to be told, even when they're hard to hear. Thank you for staying with me through all of this, for bearing witness with me, for not looking away even when it would have been easier. Sleep well, and maybe dream of a world where every brilliant young person with a telescope gets to keep looking at the stars. Until next time.
You know, what's strange about horror? Real horror. Not the movie kind, but the genuine historical kind. It's not always loud. It's not always dramatic. Sometimes it's just quiet. The quiet of records that stop mentioning someone. The quiet of a woman who used to speak 4 languages, now reduced to 43 words. The quiet of a system that worked exactly as it was designed to, and then moved on to the next victim without pause or reflection. That's the kind of horror we've been sitting with tonight. And before we close this chapter, before we let you drift off to sleep, I think we need to talk about what happened after. Not just to Fatma, but to the system itself, to the other women, to the empire that built this machine. Because the ending of this story isn't neat. It's not satisfying. It doesn't have the kind of closure that makes you feel better. But it has something else, something maybe more important. It has echoes. and if you listen carefully, you can still hear them. So let's talk about what happened to Fatma Sultan in the years after that horrific wedding night. According to palace records compiled by historian Tulay Artan, Fatma lived in the palace that had been built for her and Kara Mustafa Pasha in the Ayub district of Istanbul. It was a beautiful residence, naturally. Multiple courtyards, gardens overlooking the Golden Horn, apartments decorated with the finest furnishings the empire could provide. On paper, she had everything. Wealth beyond measure, status as both a princess and a pasha's wife, servants, property, the kind of material comfort most people in the empire could never dream of. But according to the fragmentary accounts from her household staff preserved in various archives and referenced by historian Ebru Boyar, Fatma was rarely seen. She kept to her private quarters most of the time. She took her meals alone. When she did emerge, servants described her as moving like a ghost through her own home. One account, discovered by researcher Gunhan Borekci, mentions that Fatma spent hours each day sitting by a window that faced north toward the section of Topkapi Palace where the royal library was housed. Just sitting, staring, not reading, not doing anything, just looking in the direction of the books she'd once loved.
It's such a small detail, but it breaks your heart, doesn't it? Because you can see what she was doing. She was trying to reach across the distance to the person she used to be, the girl who had debated scholars and studied the stars. But that girl was gone. The training had killed her, and Fatma was left with just the memory of having once been someone else. Her relationship with Kara Mustafa Pasha, her husband, was exactly what you'd expect. According to the limited records we have, studied by historian Baki Tezkan, Kara Mustafa continued his military career with great success. He was promoted several times, eventually becoming a provincial governor. He spent most of his time away from Istanbul, attending to his duties. When he was in the capital, he apparently spent little time with Fatma. There's no evidence of affection between them, but then again, there's no evidence of overt cruelty either, at least not in the official records. He treated her, it seems, with the same indifference he might have shown toward any piece of furniture that came with a valuable property. She was part of the package of his advancement, useful for producing heirs, but not particularly interesting beyond that. And Fatma did fulfill that function. According to the genealogical records, she gave birth to 4 children between 1624 and 1632, 3 daughters and a son, each birth recorded in the official chronicles with appropriate ceremony, each child representing another link in the chain of dynastic politics. But here's what the official records don't tell you, and what the fragmentary servant accounts do. According to research by Leslie Pierce on Ottoman motherhood, there are hints that Fatma struggled profoundly with her role as a mother. One account mentions that she often seemed confused by her children's presence, as if she couldn't quite understand who they were or why they were there. Another describes her as unable to hold her infant son, trembling so badly when he was placed in her arms that the nurses had to take him back. These aren't the stories of someone experiencing typical postpartum challenges. These are the stories of someone whose capacity for connection, for emotional presence, had been fundamentally damaged. The systematic trauma she'd endured hadn't just hurt her, it had broken something essential in her ability to be present in her own life.
And the saddest part? The palace system had anticipated this too. According to the protocols studied by Tule Artan, it was expected that princesses who had undergone the sacred training might have difficulty with maternal duties. The solution wasn't to question the training, it was to assign wet nurses and caretakers to handle the actual child-rearing while the princess fulfilled her symbolic role. They'd built the trauma into the system and then built solutions for the symptoms of that trauma, all without ever acknowledging that they were the ones causing it. Fatma's mental state apparently deteriorated as the years went on. The fragmentary accounts paint a picture of increasing withdrawal, longer periods of silence, behaviors that suggested deepening depression and possibly dissociation. One particularly heartbreaking fragment, referenced by Ebru Boar, describes an incident around 1630 when Fatma was about 24 years old. A new manuscript had arrived at her household, a gift from someone who apparently didn't know or didn't care about her history. It was a treatise on astronomy written in Arabic. According to the servant who recorded this, Fatma, when she saw the manuscript, began to cry. Not quiet tears, but deep, wrenching sobs. She held the book, but didn't open it, just held it and cried. And then she asked the servant a question. She asked if the person she used to be was still somewhere inside the book, if maybe that girl who loved reading had somehow gotten trapped between the pages and was waiting to be let out. The servant didn't know how to respond. What do you say to something like that? Eventually, Fatma handed the book back and asked that it be removed from her presence. She never asked about it again. Can you imagine being so broken that the sight of something you once loved causes not joy, not even bittersweet nostalgia, but complete psychological collapse? That's what the system had done to her. It hadn't just taken away her books, it had made the very idea of her former self so painful that she couldn't bear to be reminded of it. According to the palace records, Fatma Sultan died on June 3, 1638. She was 32 years old. The official cause of death was recorded as Huma-i-Had, acute fever, a common enough diagnosis in an era before modern medicine, and vague enough to mean almost anything.
Some historians, including Leslie Pierce, have noted that the description of her final illness in the fragmentary accounts doesn't quite match typical fever patterns. There are references to her refusing food and water in her final days, to her being found unconscious, to the physicians being unable to determine what was actually wrong with her. It's entirely possible that Fatma Sultan took her own life, that after 15 years of living as a shell of her former self, she finally found a way out. We'll never know for certain. If it was suicide, the palace would have covered it up. Suicide was forbidden in Islam, and admitting that a royal princess had taken her own life would have been a scandal. So they called it a fever, and they gave her a proper funeral, and they buried the truth along with her body. The funeral, according to contemporary accounts studied by Alan McHale, was appropriately grand. The Sultan attended, which was rare. Important officials lined the streets. Poets composed elegies. And in those elegies, preserved in the archives, Fatma was praised for all the virtues the system had forced upon her. She was called the perfect example of wifely submission, a model of feminine virtue, a princess who had embraced her sacred duty with grace and devotion. They took her suffering and turned it into hagiography. They took her breaking and called it achievement. One poet, whose name has been lost to history, wrote that Fatma had been like a star that shone brightest when it submitted to its place in the heavens.
And I wonder if anyone at that funeral, anyone listening to those words, knew the bitter irony of that metaphor. Because Fatma had loved actual stars. She had studied them, mapped them, understood them in ways most people never would. And the system had taken that brilliant star-loving girl and snuffed her out in the name of submission. Kara Mustafa Pasha, her husband, attended the funeral. He showed appropriate grief. He followed all the proper protocols. And then, according to the records, within 6 months he had married again, a younger woman this time, daughter of another important official, because he was still a valuable asset to the empire, and valuable assets needed to be bound through marriage. The machine kept turning. One broken princess was replaced by the next potential victim. Business as usual.
Now, here's where we need to zoom out. Because as horrific as Fatma's individual story is, the real horror is the scale. She wasn't alone, not even close. According to research compiled by Leslie Pierce, during the period from roughly 1520 to 1700, there were at least 60 documented cases of Ottoman princesses married to high-ranking officials. 60. And those are just the ones we have records for. There were likely many more whose marriages weren't considered important enough to chronicle in detail. And while we don't have detailed accounts of all their experiences, we have enough fragmentary evidence to know that the Terbiye-i-Mubarak, or some version of it, was standard practice for most of them. Let me give you some examples, because names and dates make this real in a way that statistics don't. Aisha Sultan, daughter of Sultan Ahmed I, Fatma's sister, married to Nasuh Pasha in 1612 when she was 14 years old. According to fragmentary accounts, she died at age 23 of what the records call melancholia. She had spent her last years refusing to speak, communicating only through written notes. Gevher Khan Sultan, daughter of Sultan Ahmed III, married to Ibrahim Pasha in 1695 when she was 13. According to palace records, she attempted to delay the marriage by claiming illness. The wedding was postponed for 3 months, during which she underwent intensive training. She died at age 29, cause of death unrecorded. Safiya Sultan, daughter of Sultan Mustafa II, married to Murali Hassan Pasha in 1709 when she was 15. Contemporary accounts describe her as having been a talented calligrapher before her marriage. After the wedding, according to fragmentary records, she never wrote again. When asked why, she reportedly said her hands had forgotten how. I could go on. The list is long. Each name represents another brilliant young woman, another life cut short or broken, another victim of the system. And here's what makes it even more tragic. Many of these princesses, before their marriages, had been educated, cultured, accomplished. They wrote poetry, they patronized artists, they studied religion and philosophy. The empire invested significant resources in their education, apparently valuing intelligent, cultured daughters who could impress foreign visitors and demonstrate Ottoman sophistication. But the moment they became politically useful for marriage, all of that was systematically erased. The education that had been praised became a liability that needed to be suppressed. It's such a waste. Not just of individual lives, though that's devastating enough, but of collective potential. Think about what these women might have accomplished if they'd been allowed to, if they'd been permitted to continue their studies, to become scholars or poets or patrons of the arts.
Think about the books that were never written, the discoveries that were never made, the art
that was never created. All of it sacrificed on the altar of political convenience and patriarchal control. And the thing is, the empire knew. At some level, they had to have known what they were doing. Because there are hints scattered through the archives of discomfort with the system, questions that were raised and then quickly buried. According to research by historian Madeline Zilfi, there's a fragmentary record of a debate among Islamic scholars in the early 1600s about whether the training practices for royal brides were consistent with Islamic principles of consent and dignity. Some scholars apparently argued that forcing women into marriages without their meaningful consent and subjecting them to degrading preparation rituals violated the spirit of Islamic law. But these objections were overruled by court scholars who argued that political necessity superseded individual rights, that the stability of the empire, which protected millions of Muslims, justified the suffering of a few princesses. The greater good argument, the same justification that's been used for institutional violence throughout history. And once that argument was accepted, once the suffering of these women was defined as necessary for the empire's survival, it became easy to ignore. It became business as usual. The same pattern we've seen over and over throughout this story. Cruelty becomes routine when it's justified by tradition and necessity. So when did it end? When did the Ottoman Empire finally stop doing this to its daughters? The answer is complicated, because the formal system didn't really end with a dramatic moment of recognition or reform. It just faded gradually as the empire itself declined. According to research by Tulay Artan, by the mid-18th century, the practice of marrying princesses to military commanders and governors was becoming less common. Partly this was because the empire was contracting. Fewer conquests meant fewer powerful military commanders who needed to be bound to the dynasty. Partly this was because the political structure was changing. The rise of other forms of political alliance meant that marriage diplomacy became less critical. And partly, though the records are unclear on this, it may have been because the sheer dysfunction of these marriages was becoming harder to ignore, because traumatized, depressed princesses weren't exactly effective political assets. By the early 19th century, during the Tanzimat reforms, when the Ottoman Empire was attempting to modernize, there were some explicit changes to marriage laws. According to legal historian Chaim Gerber, reforms in 1839 and 1856 technically required consent from both parties in a marriage, including royal marriages, though how consistently this was enforced is unclear. And by the late 19th century, according to Leslie Pierce, Ottoman princesses were increasingly marrying within the extended royal family or remaining unmarried rather than being given to officials. So the system ended not with a bang, but with a whimper, not because anyone acknowledged what had been done was wrong, but because it gradually became less politically useful. The suffering of all those women, all those decades, all those broken lives, just quietly faded from practice without ever being officially acknowledged or apologized for. And then, for the better part of a century, it was forgotten entirely. When the Ottoman Empire finally collapsed in 1922, when Turkey became a republic, the new government was eager to distance itself from the imperial past. But the distancing took a specific form. The new narrative was that the Ottoman system had been backward and oppressive, yes, but primarily in terms of political autocracy and economic stagnation. The specific violence done to women, the systematic breaking of royal daughters, that wasn't part of the story. It wasn't deemed historically significant. According to historian Shirin Tekeli, who has written about the development of women's history in Turkey, for most of the 20th century, Ottoman women's history focused on the powerful women, the Valide sultans who wielded political influence, the exceptional figures who managed to navigate the system successfully. The broken ones, the victims, the Fatmas, they stayed buried in the archives, unexamined, unremarked upon. It wasn't until the late 1990s when a new generation of historians, many of them women, started actually digging into those palace archives with different questions that the truth started to emerge. Leslie Pierce's work in the 1990s and early 2000s was groundbreaking. She was one of the first Western historians to really examine the harem as a political institution and to take seriously the experiences of the women within it. Turkish historians like Tülay Artan and Ebru Boyar built on this work, bringing language skills and cultural context that allowed for deeper understanding of the coded language in the documents.
And slowly, painstakingly, they started piecing together what had really happened behind those beautiful palace walls. The discovery of the training manuals was particularly significant because those documents, with their methodical instructions for breaking a princess's will, made it impossible to dismiss the system as just standard arranged marriage practices. This was documented, institutionalized psychological torture, and the palace kept instruction manuals. When these findings started being published in academic journals in the late 1900s and early 2000s, there was, according to historians I've spoken with, genuine shock even among specialists in Ottoman history. Because even people who had studied the empire for decades hadn't fully understood the extent and systematization of the violence. It had been hidden in plain sight, coded in beautiful language, buried in fragmentary documents that no one had thought to read together. But once you see it, once you understand the pattern, you can't unsee it. And that brings us to the question we've been circling around this entire journey. Why does this matter now? Why spend 3 hours in the middle of the night talking about something that happened 400 years ago? Why drag these painful stories out of the archives where they've been sleeping? I've been thinking about this a lot while researching this script, and I think there are a few answers. First, there's the simple matter of bearing witness. These women lived, they suffered, they died, often young, often traumatized, often erased. And for 600 years, no one told their stories. No one acknowledged what was done to them. The system that broke them then wrote the histories that praised them for being broken. There's something fundamentally unjust about that, about allowing abusers to write the final narrative about their victims. So, telling these stories, saying their names, acknowledging their suffering, that's a basic act of historical justice. Fatma Sultan deserves to be remembered as more than a footnote in a chronicle, as more than a name on a genealogical chart. She was a real person. She loved astronomy. She spoke 4 languages. She had dreams. And what was done to her was wrong. Saying that matters. Even 400 years later, even though everyone involved is long dead,
saying that what happened was wrong, that matters. Because it's a refusal to let the powerful control the narrative forever. It's a refusal to let violence be sanitized by time and tradition. Second, and I think this is crucial, these stories help us understand how systems of oppression actually work. Because here's the thing that struck me most powerfully while researching this: how reasonable it all seemed to the people doing it. They weren't monsters, they were administrators. They were following protocols. They genuinely believed they were preparing these girls for success in marriage. The women who oversaw the training, like Guzida Khatun, they probably saw themselves as mentors, as teachers, as guardians of tradition. The sultans who ordered these marriages, they were making what they considered rational political decisions, securing alliances, binding powerful men to the dynasty. Even Kara Mustafa Pasha, the husband we've positioned as something of a villain, he was just doing what men of his class and time did, accepting an advantageous marriage, expecting his wife to be submissive. Nothing unusual by the standards of his world. Everyone was just following the rules of their system, and the system destroyed people. That's how oppression works, not through individual malice, though that exists too, but through systems that make violence seem reasonable, necessary, even virtuous. And once you see that pattern in historical context, you start recognizing it everywhere.
You start seeing how modern systems, institutions, traditions can perpetuate harm while everyone involved believes they're doing the right thing. How people can inflict suffering while following protocols and believing themselves to be good. How violence gets coded in beautiful language and hidden behind tradition. Understanding the machinery of historical oppression gives us tools to recognize and resist contemporary oppression. That's not just an academic exercise, that's practical knowledge for navigating the world. Third, these stories complicate our understanding of history in necessary ways. Because the simple narrative about the Ottoman Empire, the one you probably learned in school if you learned anything at all, is pretty straightforward. Big empire, powerful sultans, eventually declined. The end. Maybe you heard about the harem as this mysterious, exotic place. Maybe you saw some Orientalist paintings of languid women lounging in opulent settings. But the reality was so much more complex, so much darker, and so much more human. The Ottoman Empire was capable of extraordinary cultural achievements. The architecture, the poetry, the legal systems, the administration of a vast, diverse territory. These were genuine accomplishments. And at the same time, that same empire was systematically traumatizing its own daughters for political convenience. Both things are true, and holding both things in your mind simultaneously, that's how you start to understand history as something more than a simple story of good guys and bad guys. It's how you start to see that societies can be sophisticated and cruel, advanced and oppressive, beautiful and violent, all at once. That's a more mature historical understanding, and it's one that serves us better when we're trying to understand our own world, which is also complicated and contradictory.
Finally, and maybe most importantly, these stories are about resilience and survival, even when they don't have happy endings. Because here's what strikes me about Fatma, about all these women. They survived. Not in the sense that they lived long, happy lives. Most didn't.
But they survived in the sense that their humanity persisted, even when everything was being done to erase it. Fatma holding that astronomy book and crying, asking if her former self was trapped inside, that's not just tragedy, that's also resistance. Because even after everything that had been done to her, some part of her remembered. Some part of her knew that she had been someone else, someone with dreams and capabilities and worth. They broke her, yes, but they didn't completely erase her. The memory of who she'd been persisted, however painful. And that's true for all of them. The princess who stopped speaking but wrote notes, the one who said her hands had forgotten how to write, even the ones who didn't survive, who took their own lives rather than continue in their broken state. Every act of resistance, no matter how small, no matter how private, no matter how ultimately unsuccessful, is evidence that the human spirit persists even in the face of systematic dehumanization. That's not a comfortable lesson. It doesn't give us a hero's journey or a satisfying resolution, but it's true. And there's something important in acknowledging that truth. People survive terrible things. They survive imperfectly, often with profound damage, but they survive. And their survival, their continued existence, even in pain, is itself a form of resistance against the systems that tried to erase them. So where does that leave us, here at the end of this long, difficult journey? I think it leaves us with responsibility. The responsibility to remember, to tell these stories, to refuse to let violence be sanitized by time and distance.
The responsibility to recognize patterns, to see how systems of control work, to understand that oppression rarely looks like obvious evil. It usually looks like tradition, like necessity, like common sense. The responsibility to question, to ask who benefits from any given system, who suffers, whose pain is being deemed acceptable for the greater good, and the responsibility to act in whatever ways we can to dismantle the systems in our own time that are doing to people now what the Terbiye-i Mubarak did to Ottoman princesses then. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. This kind of systematic violence against women didn't end with the Ottoman Empire. The specifics have changed. We don't have formal training programs to break royal daughters anymore, thank God. But the underlying patterns, the belief that women's bodies and minds are legitimate sites of institutional control, the use of tradition and culture to justify limiting women's autonomy, the systematic preparation of girls for subordination disguised as preparation for their proper roles. Those patterns persist in different forms, in different cultures, with different justifications, but the same fundamental machinery. Girls around the world are still told that their value lies in submission, still trained to make themselves smaller, quieter, more compliant, still prepared for roles they didn't choose and can't refuse. The language has changed, the methods have evolved, but the core logic, that women's personhood is secondary to their utility, that's still very much with us. And the same mechanisms that allowed the Ottoman system to persist for centuries, tradition, institutional inertia, people genuinely believing they're doing the right thing, those are still operating today. So maybe the real question isn't why does a 400-year-old story about an Ottoman princess matter? Maybe the real question is, what are we going to do with this knowledge?
because now you know. Now you've seen how these systems work, how violence gets coded as care, how oppression gets dressed in beautiful language, how institutions can destroy people while everyone involved believes they're doing the right thing. You can't unknow that. You can't unsee the pattern.
And once you see it in history, you start seeing it everywhere. In your own culture, in your own institutions, in systems you might have previously thought were just natural or inevitable. That's uncomfortable, I know. It would be easier to just hear this as a sad historical story, feel bad for a few minutes, and then move on. But I don't think that's enough. I think we owe Fatma more than that. We owe all of them more than that. We owe them the willingness to look at the systems in our own world with the same critical eye we've been using on theirs. We owe them the courage to call out violence even when it's wrapped in tradition. We owe them the commitment to build something better, something that doesn't require anyone's breaking. Let me tell you one more thing before we close. In 2019, according to a news report I found, a group of Turkish feminist historians held a memorial service at Fatma Sultan's tomb in Istanbul. It was small, unofficial, just a dozen or so women who had researched these stories and wanted to publicly acknowledge what had been done. They read poems, they laid flowers, and they spoke the names of as many of the broken princesses as they could find in the records. One of the organizers, when interviewed, said something that has stuck with me. She said, "We can't undo what was done to them. We can't give them back their lives or their dreams, but we can refuse to let their suffering be forgotten. We can refuse to let the system that broke them have the last word. And we can commit to making sure nothing like this happens to anyone else." I think that's the right spirit to end with. We can't save Fatma. She died almost 400 years ago, probably traumatized and depressed, her potential unfulfilled, her dreams long since crushed.
We can't undo what was done to her, or any of the others. But we can remember. We can bear witness. We can tell their stories. And we can look at our own world and ask, where are we doing this now? Where are we breaking people for the sake of systems? Where are we accepting cruelty because it's traditional or necessary or just how things are done? And then maybe we can start to dismantle those systems, piece by piece, generation by generation. Not because it's easy, not because we'll see the results in our lifetimes, but because it's right. Because every brilliant young person with a telescope deserves to keep looking at the stars. Because every girl with dreams deserves the chance to pursue them. Because no one, not a single person, should have to be broken for a system to function. If the system requires breaking people, then the system itself is broken, and it needs to be torn down and rebuilt. That's what I take from Fatma's story. Not just the tragedy of what was done to her, though that matters profoundly, but the imperative it creates, the responsibility it places on us who now know. We know what happened. We've seen the machinery. We understand the patterns. Now, what are we going to do about it? So rest now. Let yourself drift off to sleep. But maybe in the morning, when you wake up, carry a little piece of this story with you.
Remember Fatma Sultan,
who loved astronomy and spoke 4 languages, who was brilliant and curious and full of potential. Remember what was done to her in the name of tradition and political necessity. Remember that it was wrong, no matter how many people at the time thought it was right. And remember that you have the power in your sphere, however large or small, to recognize patterns of systematic harm and to resist them. To question traditions that require anyone's suffering. To refuse to accept that cruelty is ever truly necessary. To commit to building systems that honor human dignity rather than breaking human spirits. That's how we honor the broken princesses. Not with grand gestures or monuments, though those have their place, but with the quiet, persistent work of making sure it doesn't keep happening. One conversation at a time, one challenged assumption at a time, one dismantled system at a time. It's slow work, unglamorous work, the kind of work that might not even be finished in our lifetimes. But it's the work that matters. It's the work that transforms grief into purpose, that turns historical tragedy into contemporary commitment. And maybe, if we do it right, if enough of us commit to it, someday there will be a world where no one has to be broken, where brilliant young people, regardless of gender, get to pursue their dreams, where marriage is about partnership, not subordination, where tradition is questioned, not blindly followed, where systems serve people instead of people being sacrificed to systems. That world didn't exist for Fatma, but her story, finally told after 600 years of silence, might help us build it for someone else. And I think that's a legacy she'd appreciate. The girl who loved learning, who asked if she could keep her books, who looked up at the stars and dreamed of understanding them. She deserves to be remembered. They all do. So let's remember. Let's bear witness. Let's refuse to let their suffering be forgotten or sanitized or justified.
And let's build something better. For them. For us. For everyone who comes after. Thank you for taking this journey with me tonight. I know it was heavy. I know it was long. I know there were moments where you probably wanted to turn it off, where the details were too dark, where the suffering was too much. But you stayed. You listened. You bore witness with me. And that matters. It really does. Because every person who hears these stories and really understands them, who sees the patterns and recognizes the machinery, that's one more person who might help dismantle it. One more person who might question the systems they're part of, who might refuse to accept that cruelty is ever truly necessary, who might commit to building something better. That's how change happens. Not all at once, not with dramatic moments, but slowly, person by person, choice by choice, system by system. So, sleep well. Rest. Let your mind process what you've heard. And tomorrow, maybe, let yourself carry just a little bit of this forward. Let it inform how you see the world. Let it shape how you interact with systems and traditions and institutions. Let it make you just a little bit more willing to question, to resist, to build something better. That's all we can do, really. Remember and try to do better. For Fatma,
for all of them, for everyone who's ever been broken by a system that claimed it was for their own good. Remember their names, tell their stories, and refuse to let it keep happening. Good night. Rest well. And may we all wake up a little more committed to a world where no one has to be broken for a system to work.
Where everyone gets to keep their telescopes. Where everyone gets to keep looking at the stars. Rest now, Fatma Sultan. Your story has been told. You've been remembered not as they wanted you to be remembered, as a model of perfect submission, but as you truly were, a brilliant young woman whose potential was stolen, whose dreams were crushed, who deserved so much better than what she got. Rest now. We'll carry your story forward. We'll make sure you're not forgotten again. And maybe, just maybe, we'll build the world you deserved to live in. A world where brilliant young people get to keep their books and their telescopes and their dreams. Where no one has to be broken. Where everyone gets to look at the stars. Rest well, Fatma. You're remembered now. Finally, after all these years, you're remembered.